Nathaniel Brooks did not even have the decency to be there. That was the part that cut deepest, not the letter itself, though the letter was bad enough. It was the fact that he had sent a stranger to hand it to her, a boy barely 16, who could not meet her eyes, and shuffled his boots against the platform boards while she stood there in her traveling dress with her trunk at her feet, and the whole town of Silver Creek watching. She had traveled 1,890 miles. He could not walk 200 yards to say it to her face. Evelyn Mercer opened the envelope right there on the platform, in the wind, with people pretending not to stare, and she read the words that Nathaniel Brooks had written in his careful banker's hand. The arrangement between us is hereby concluded. You are not expected at the ranch. Do not come, there is nothing here for you. No apology. No explanation. No acknowledgement that she had sold her furniture, given notice on her apartment, and stepped off the edge of her known world on the promise of his word. Nothing here for you. If you have ever stood in a place you did not choose, holding something that has just been taken from you, and felt every eye in the room measure your humiliation if you have ever had to decide, in that single terrible moment, whether to collapse or to stand, then you already understand what Evelyn Mercer felt standing on that platform in Silver Creek, Montana, in the autumn of 1887. And if you want to know what she did next, because what she did next changed everything, stay with this story. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss what happens when an ordinary woman refuses an extraordinary injustice. Like this video, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Because it's about to go somewhere none of them expected. The train had been 3 hours late, which meant Evelyn had spent 3 hours on a bench in the depot watching the other passengers collect their people and their luggage and disappear into the town beyond the platform doors. By the time the porter finally announced Silver Creek, she was stiff in her shoulders and dry in her throat, and she had rehearsed her first words to Nathaniel Brooks approximately 40 times. She had settled on something simple, practical. I hope the journey treated you as well as your letters suggested it would. Not overly warm, they were still strangers, technically, but not cold either, friendly and composed. The kind of opening line that left room for both of them to breathe before the awkwardness of actually being in the same space for the first time settled around them. She had practiced the handshake. She had considered and reconsidered whether to remove her glove for it. None of that happened. Instead, the boy with the letter found her on the platform before she had even collected her trunk from the baggage car. He said her name, Miss Mercer, with a question in it that told her he was not entirely sure he had the right woman. And when she turned and said yes, he held out the envelope the way a person holds something they do not want to be responsible for. She read it once. Then she read it again, because the first time did not fully land. Then she folded it, put it in her coat pocket, and looked up. The platform had not emptied yet. A cluster of women in town dresses stood near the depot entrance, and they were not pretending not to look anymore. Two of them leaned toward each other and exchanged something under their breath. A man near the freight door nudged his companion and tilted his chin in her direction. She saw a woman put her hand over her mouth, though whether from shock or from suppressed laughter, Evelyn could not tell and did not particularly want to know. The boy was still standing there. "Ma'am, do you need me to?" "No," Evelyn said. "Thank you." She turned back to the baggage car and found the porter waiting beside her trunk. It was not a small trunk. It was the kind of trunk that held a person's entire portable life books, winter clothing, her mother's tablecloth, 2 changes of good dress, her ledger notebooks, the box of correspondence she had kept because she had believed, at the time, that it might matter one day to have a record of what had passed between them. The porter looked at her, then at the trunk, then back at her, with the expression of a man who understood exactly what had just happened and was deciding whether to say anything about it. He said nothing. He helped her move the trunk to the platform edge, took his tip, and went back to his work. Evelyn stood beside the trunk and calculated. She had $11.30. She had a return train ticket that was not valid for 2 weeks, because Nathaniel Brooks had written in his third letter that she would want time to settle in before the journey back east for the holidays, and she had believed him, and so she had asked the travel agent to book accordingly. The ticket could be exchanged, but there would be a fee. She did not know exactly how much the fee would be. She suspected it would be more than $11. She also had nowhere to sleep tonight. These were the facts. She arranged them in her mind the way she used to arrange figures in an account ledger, not with panic, but with the cold intention of someone who has worked with difficult numbers before and knows that the first step is always to understand exactly how bad the situation is before you decide what to do about it. The situation was quite bad. She picked up the handle of her trunk and began to drag it toward the depot entrance. It was heavy. The wheels caught on the gap between platform boards. She had to stop twice to reposition her grip. Nobody offered to help. The women near the entrance parted to let her through, but they did it in that particular way, stepping back just slightly more than necessary, creating just slightly too much space that communicated both pity and the desire not to be associated with the spectacle of her. She thanked them anyway, clearly audibly. They did not respond. Inside the depot, she found a bench against the far wall and sat with her trunk beside her, and her hands folded in her lap, and let herself think without anyone watching her do it. She was 31 years old. She had spent the last 9 years keeping the accounts for her uncle's shipping firm in Boston, a job she had been given reluctantly, and kept through the quality of her work when 2 of the men hired after her had made costly errors she had caught and documented before they became disasters. She was good with numbers. She was better at spotting patterns, the kind of small, consistent irregularities that most people dismissed as accidents, but that, in her experience, were almost never accidents. She had come to Montana because her uncle had died and left the business to his son, who had no use for female employees and considerably less patience for ones who argued with his expense reports. And because Nathaniel Brooks's letters had been, she had to admit this honestly, genuinely good, thoughtful. He had asked real questions about what she valued and what she believed, and he had answered her questions without deflecting. He had described the ranch in a way that made it sound like work worth doing, not just a comfortable life being handed to a woman who had run out of other options. She had not been naive. She had been careful. She had apparently not been careful enough. The depot had a small window that looked out onto the main street of Silver Creek, and through it she watched the afternoon move past. Wagons. A pair of horses tied to a post outside what looked like a general store. A man in a good coat who walked with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who owned something he wanted people to notice. She watched him for a moment. There was something in the set of his shoulders, the way he moved through the street without adjusting his path for anyone, the way the 2 men he passed both angled themselves slightly aside, that told her he was accustomed to having space made for him. She filed that away without knowing yet why it mattered. She was still sitting there when Elias Carter came in. He was not what she would have expected from a Montana rancher, though she admitted to herself that her expectation had been formed largely by Nathaniel Brooks's letters, which had described the men of Silver Creek in terms that made them sound either rough and simple or rough and dangerous. Elias was neither. He was perhaps 35, with the kind of face that had been weathered by outdoor work, rather than age sun-darkened at the cheekbones, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he squinted into the distance more often than he smiled. He wore working clothes, not dress clothes, but they were clean and in decent repair, which told her something about how he thought about himself. He did not come over to her directly. He collected something from the depot clerk, a package, smallish, wrapped in brown paper, and then he turned, and he saw her, and he stopped. He did not do what the others had done. He did not look away quickly or exchange a glance with someone behind her. He simply looked at her directly for a moment, and then he walked over. "You're the woman from the platform," he said. Not a question. "Apparently," Evelyn said. "You need somewhere to stay tonight." It was also not a question. She found this more useful than offensive. Was reading the situation, not asking her to explain it. "I need somewhere to stay for several nights," she said, because there was no point in being imprecise. Possibly longer, depending on the exchange fee at the railway office. He nodded slowly. He looked at her trunk, then at her. "Broken River Ranch is 4 miles out. You'd have a room." "It's not." He paused, as if measuring what he was about to say. "It's not what you came here expecting." "Nothing about today is what I came here expecting," Evelyn said. Something shifted in his expression, not pity, which she would have rejected immediately, but something more like recognition, as though he understood what it was to arrive at a situation you had not chosen and find it considerably worse than advertised. "I've got a wagon outside," he said. She stood up. She pulled her coat straight. She looked at her trunk, and he moved to take the handle without being asked, and he did not make a production of the weight of it, and she followed him out into the Montana afternoon. The road to Broken River Ranch was unpaved and cut across land that seemed to go on in every direction without apology. Evelyn had not been west of Ohio before this week, and she had not been prepared for the scale of it, the way the sky took up more of what you saw than the ground did, the way distance became unreliable, the way things that looked close turned out to be miles away. Montana did not compress itself to suit you. It was simply there, enormous and indifferent, and you could either make your peace with that or spend your time here feeling overwhelmed by it. She decided, somewhere along that 4-mile road, to make her peace with it. Elias drove without talking much, which she appreciated. He answered what she asked, the names of things, basic facts about the land, how long the ranch had been in his family, but he did not perform for her, did not work to impress her or manage her impression of him. He answered questions and then stopped talking. She found this restful after the long, anxious days of the journey, during which she had spent too much time trying to imagine a conversation she was now never going to have. "Your father's ranch originally?" she asked. "His before mine?" "He died 2 years ago spring, I'm sorry. He had time to settle things. Or thought he did." He said this with a tightness in the jaw that suggested settling things had turned out to be more complicated than his father had anticipated. "What happened?" He was quiet for a moment. The wagon moved over a rough section of road, and her trunk shifted against the boards behind her, and she put a hand back without thinking to steady it. "Debt," he said finally. "Ranch has been carrying debt I can't account for. I've been through the books 3 times, and I can't make the numbers come out to where they should be." Evelyn looked at him sideways. "What do you mean you can't account for it?" "I mean the debt exists. I mean we owe money to people and institutions I have records for. But when I try to track back through what we spent it on, what we borrowed it for, the trail gets muddy. Things that should correspond don't." "How long has this been going on?" "Best I can tell, 4 years, maybe 5. She said nothing for a moment. She was doing something she had learned to do with account books, reading the space between the stated facts, looking for where the shape of the story didn't fit the shape of the numbers. "Has anyone else looked at the records?" "The bank sent a man. He confirmed the debt was real. He didn't seem particularly interested in where it came from." Another pause. "Foreclosure notice came last month." The word landed quietly between them. Evelyn understood what foreclosure meant for a family ranch that had been someone's father's before it was his. She understood it not sentimentally, but practically, the way a person who has handled other people's financial records for years understands what it means when something that has existed for a generation suddenly has a price attached to it. "Could I look at the books?" she asked. He turned to look at her then for the first time since they'd set out. She could not read his expression precisely, but it was not dismissive. He looked at her the way someone looks when they are deciding whether to say something they have been keeping to themselves. "You're an accountant?" he said. "I'm a woman who kept accounts for 9 years for a shipping firm," she said. "I found 4 separate instances of deliberate manipulation in that time. My employer at the time described it as," she paused, choosing the accurate word, "unlikely. But the numbers were the numbers." He looked at the road again. The ranch came into view ahead a main house, 2 outbuildings, a barn that had seen better years but was still standing, and she could see at a glance that it was a working ranch and not a prosperous one. The gaps between prosperous and working were visible if you knew where to look, and Evelyn had spent enough time with other people's finances to know where to look. "Yeah," he said. "You can look at the books." The room she was given was small and clean, and had a window that faced east, which meant light in the morning, which she preferred. The bed was narrow. There was a washstand and a good lamp and a chair that wobbled slightly but was otherwise serviceable. She had stayed in worse in Boston. In the years before her uncle's salary had settled her into something more comfortable, she unpacked only what she needed for the night. The rest could wait until she knew how long she was staying, which she did not yet know. She had not let herself think past the next immediate problem since stepping off the platform, because she had found over the years that thinking past the next immediate problem was the fastest way to become paralyzed by all the ones after it. The immediate problem was she needed to look at those books tonight. She said so over dinner, which was beans and salt pork and bread that was 2 days old but still good enough to eat, prepared by a woman named Ruth who cooked for the ranch hands and said almost nothing to Evelyn except to ask if she took coffee, and when Evelyn said yes, Ruth provided it without further commentary. There were 2 ranch hands at the table, a young man named Percy, who kept looking at Evelyn as though he was trying to work out how to categorize her, and an older man named Walt, who ate with the efficient patience of someone who has spent decades doing physical work and treats meals as fuel rather than entertainment. Elias brought the ledgers to the table after Ruth cleared the dishes. They were 3 of them, 2 older, 1 current, and they were the kind of ledgers kept by someone who understood the basic principles of bookkeeping, but who had not always been consistent about it. His father's entries were careful and regular in the early years. Then they changed. The handwriting became inconsistent. Some pages had clearly been kept by someone else, the letter forms different, the pressure of the pen different, the way numbers were formed slightly but distinctly not his father's habit. Evelyn noticed this within the first 10 minutes. She said nothing about it yet. She kept reading. The payments appeared on page 37 of the second ledger. A company called Meridian Land Holdings. The first payment was dated autumn 1882, 5 years back. The amount was not enormous. The second payment 6 months later was larger. By the third entry, the payments had become regular, quarterly, and significant enough that they were materially affecting the ranch's financial position. She cross-referenced with the expense records. There was no corresponding purchase, No service rendered, no notation explaining what Meridian Land Holdings provided in exchange for the money. In her experience, that absence of explanation was never an accident. Legitimate expenses got described because the person paying them wanted to remember what they were for. Payments that didn't need to be remembered were often payments that couldn't be explained. "What is Meridian Land Holdings?" she asked. Elias looked up from across the table. He had been watching her work without interfering, which she appreciated. "I don't know. I've never heard of it. It's received over $4,000 from this ranch in the last 4 years." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. "That's not possible," he said. But the way he said it low and flat rather than shocked told her that somewhere he had feared something like this was possible and had not wanted to look directly at it. "The entries are here," she said. She turned the ledger toward him and pointed. "These payments." And the handwriting on these pages, she turned back to an earlier section, compared the two, is not the same as the earlier entries. Someone else made these. He leaned forward and looked at the pages for a long time. His jaw was set. She could see something working behind his eyes, not the simple mathematics of the discovery, but the larger arithmetic of what it meant. Someone had been inside his father's records. Someone had been taking money that did not belong to them and leaving tracks just careful enough to be plausible, just careless enough to be found if you knew what you were looking for. "Who handled the books when your father was away?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Greer," he said, "the foreman at the time. He left about 8 months after my father died. Said he had family business." She wrote the name in the margin of her own notebook. "And Meridian Land Holdings," she said. "Do you know anyone who might be associated with a company by that name?" He looked at her, and she watched something cross his face, something that looked like a conclusion arriving, that he had been keeping at arm's length for some time. "Brooks," he said. "Nathaniel Brooks runs several business interests through the county. I've never been able to track all of them. He's careful about what he puts his name to directly." Evelyn set her pen down. She looked at the ledger. She looked at the name she had written, Greer, and beneath it wrote a second name slowly, deliberately. Meridian Land Holdings, N. Brooks. The man who had rejected her by letter before she even stepped off the train. The man she had seen walking the main street of Silver Creek with the ease of someone accustomed to having space made for them. She had been turning over in her mind for hours why he had broken the arrangement without explanation. The letters had been real. The interest had seemed genuine. Then abruptly, she was no longer expected. She had wondered if she had said something wrong in her last letters, something that had offended him, or signaled something he didn't want. She had read that letter over on the train 3 times, looking for the mistake. But there was no mistake in her letter. She understood now, with the clarity that comes when something you have been circling suddenly reveals its actual shape, that his decision had nothing to do with a mistake. She had written in that final letter about her work at the shipping firm. She had described with some pride, because she had been proud of it, the instance in which she had identified a pattern of fraudulent billing that had been missed by 2 of the firm's partners. She had explained specifically the method she used, the cross-referencing, the attention to handwriting variation, the way she compared stated expenses against documented outcomes. She had told Nathaniel Brooks, in her own words, precisely how she found things that people tried to hide. And 2 weeks later, he had written her a letter telling her not to come. She sat with this understanding for a long moment. The lamp on the table made a small sound. Outside, the Montana night pressed against the window, enormous and patient. "He didn't cancel the arrangement because he changed his mind about me," she said. Elias looked at her. He had followed her reasoning, or most of it, she could see that. "He canceled it because he recognized what I would find if I got close enough to look," she said. The words settled between them, like something solid, like a document, like evidence. She picked up her pen. "I need to see everything," she said. "Every record your father kept. Tax file, boundary survey, water access agreements, original deed. Anything with dates on it going back to before 20,882. "That's a lot of paper," Elias said. "Yes," she said. "It usually is when someone's been careful about it." He looked at her for a moment, and she could not entirely read what was in his expression, because she was tired and she had had an extraordinary day, and she was not at her most perceptive. But it was not skepticism. It was not condescension. It was the expression of a man looking at someone who has just named the thing he did not know how to name himself, and finding that naming it made it less terrifying rather than more. "I'll get the boxes from the study," he said. He stood up from the table. He went to get the boxes. Evelyn opened to a fresh page in her notebook and wrote the date at the top. She wrote it in the careful, deliberate hand of someone beginning a document they intend to finish. She had arrived in Silver Creek that morning with nothing. By midnight, she had the beginning of something else entirely. She worked through the night. Not all of it. She was not 20 years old anymore. and her body had spent 3 days on trains before this, and there was a point somewhere around 2 in the morning where her eyes stopped tracking the columns cleanly, and she recognized this as a signal rather than a weakness. She marked her place in the ledger with a strip of paper torn from the back of her notebook, capped her pen, and went to bed. But she was up again before the ranch stirred, before the hands came in from the bunkhouse, before Ruth arrived to start the kitchen fire. Sitting at the study table with the lamp and a cup of water, she'd drawn herself from the kitchen pump, working. By the time Elias came in from the morning barn check, she had covered 14 pages of her notebook. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her. He had not expected her to be there. She could tell by the way he checked himself mid-step the slight recalibration, as if he'd walked into a room and found the furniture arranged differently than he'd left it. "Coffee's on," he said after a moment. "I know, I made it." He came in and looked at the table, the ledgers spread open at various pages, her notebook full of figures and cross-references, the additional boxes of records she'd pulled from the shelf after he'd gone to bed. He did not say anything immediately. She had learned in the one day she'd known him that he thought before he spoke, which was rarer than people imagined and more useful than most virtues. "You found something," he said. Not a question this time either. "Several things," she said. "Sit down. This will take a few minutes to explain properly." He sat. He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug she'd set out without thinking about it, and he waited. She had organized her findings the way she always organized difficult financial information in the order she had found it, not in the order she wanted to present it, because the order of discovery mattered. It showed the shape of the deception rather than just the conclusion of it. She had learned this at the shipping firm, where the partners had initially been more interested in the bottom line than the method, and where she had eventually persuaded them that understanding how a fraud worked was the only way to ensure it did not happen again. "The Meridian Land Holdings payments," she said, turning her notebook toward him. "I've gone back to the first one now. It predates your father's illness by about 8 months. The first entry is here, October 1881. Small amount, $22 listed only as land services. No description of what services. No corresponding work order." Elias looked at the page. "The payments become larger and more regular starting in the spring of 1882, she continued. "And here's what I noticed about the timing." She flipped to a marked page in the second ledger. "Every significant payment to Meridian Land Holdings appears within 2 to 4 weeks of a period when your father was absent from the ranch. These three," she pointed to 3 entries, "correspond to the months your father spent in Helena for medical treatment, which you mentioned he did twice in 1882 and once in 1883. Elias set down his mug. He looked at the entries without speaking. "Whoever was recording these payments was careful about the timing," she said. "They weren't made constantly. They were made when there was the least chance of your father reviewing the books immediately afterward. The entries would have had weeks to settle before he came back, by which point they'd look like any other line item." "Greer," Elias said. His voice was flat and controlled in the way of a person who is managing something that wants to become anger. "The handwriting matches on at least 14 entries, she said. "I can't be certain without a verified sample, but the letter formations, the way the 7s are crossed, the particular shape of the capital M, they're consistent throughout, and they're distinct from your father's hand and from the entries made in what I believe is your hand in the recent ledger." "My father trusted him," Elias said. "He'd worked the ranch for 11 years. Evelyn nodded. She did not soften this or explain it. Some things did not have a softer version, and she had learned that offering one tended to feel worse than leaving a hard fact alone. "There's more," she said. He looked up. She turned to the section she had flagged with 3 strips of paper. "The debt itself. I've traced the loan originations as far back as the records go. Your father borrowed against the ranch twice, once as 1,878 to build the second barn, once in 1,880 for livestock expansion. Both loans were with the Territorial Bank. Both were being repaid on schedule." She tapped the notebook. "The debt that is currently threatening foreclosure is different. It originates in 1883, and the creditor listed is not the Territorial Bank. It's a private lending entity called Western Capital Associates." She watched his face. "I've never heard of Western Capital Associates," he said. "I would be surprised if you had," she said. "There are no loan documents in your father's files for any arrangement with Western Capital Associates. There is no promissory note, no agreement, no correspondence. What exists is a series of entries in the ledger again. In the handwriting, I've been calling Greer's noting repayments to Western Capital Associates for a loan your father apparently contracted in the spring of 1883. A loan that doesn't have paperwork. A loan for which I can find no paperwork in any record your father kept," she said carefully. That doesn't mean the paperwork doesn't exist elsewhere. The bank will have something. But the fact that your father's files, which are otherwise reasonably complete, contain no originating documentation for this loan is significant. Elias was quiet for a long moment. She could see him constructing something in his mind, the same way she had spent the last several hours constructing it in hers. Someone created a debt that my father didn't actually contract, he said. That is one explanation for what the record suggests, she said. The other is that your father did contract it, and the paperwork was removed after the fact. Both are serious. The first is fraud of a particular kind. The second involves the deliberate suppression of documents, which is also not legal. And the land surveys? He said. He had remembered she realized she'd mentioned surveys last night, before they'd both gone quiet with tiredness. She turned to the last flagged section. This was the part that had made her sit very still for nearly 10 minutes when she'd first worked it out, just before 2 o'clock, before she'd acknowledged that her eyes were going and gone to bed. Your father's original deed describes the eastern boundary of Broken River Ranch as running to Coulter's Creek. That's the waterway. She had found a rough map in a property folder, not a surveyor's map, just a sketch made by someone who wanted to remember the shape of the land, and she placed it on the table. The county land office should have a survey record that corresponds to this deed. What I found in your files is a survey dated 1884 a year, after your father's health had declined significantly, that places the eastern boundary approximately 300 yards west of the creek. Elias went very still, 300 yards, he said, which would effectively remove the creek-adjacent grazing land from your property, she said, and the water access rights that go with it. Land adjacent to a reliable water source is considerably more valuable than land without it, both for ranching and for any future sale or acquisition. She let that sit. He looked at the sketch, at the boundary she had marked in her notebook, at the distance between where his deed said the eastern line fell and where the 1884 survey put it. She watched him understand it completely. Not just the what of it, the financial damage, the lost grazing, the foreclosure that became inevitable once you removed a ranch's most valuable assets and saddled it with manufactured debt, but the how and the why and the who. He was setting us up to fail, Elias said, over several years, she said, carefully, with people inside the operation to do the work. The result is that Broken River Ranch appears to a bank, or to a court, or to any outside observer, to be a ranch that borrowed heavily, managed poorly, and is now unable to service its debts. The natural outcome of that is foreclosure. And at foreclosure, someone buys it, he said, at a fraction of what it's actually worth, because the land records show a smaller and less valuable property. And whoever buys it, she said, would need to know that the survey is false, would need to have the means to have it corrected afterward, or to simply operate with the knowledge that the actual boundary is different from what the county has on record. That takes either a great deal of influence over local officials, or the ability to place your own people in the relevant positions, or both. She did not say Brooks's name. She did not need to. It was already in the room with them. Elias stood up from the table. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, and she let him have that for a minute. Outside she could hear the ranch beginning its morning, the particular sounds of animals and work, and the kind of routine that requires a place to exist in order to continue. What do you need, he said, without turning around. It was, she thought, exactly the right question. Not what should I do or what do we do now, but both of which would have placed the problem back in her hands. But what do you need? Which acknowledged that she had a plan in motion and asked how he could be useful to it. I need to see the original survey documents at the county land office, she said. I need to find whoever conducted the 1884 survey and establish whether they still have their original field notes. Surveyors typically keep field notes separately from the documents they submit to the county. If the submitted survey was altered, the field notes may not match. He turned around. Aldous Pratt did the county surveys in the 1880s. He still has an office in town. I need the original deed recorded when your father first established title to this land. And I need to find someone who has access to historical county records, not through the current office, because I don't know yet whether the current office is part of this, but through some other channel. Margaret Whitfield, he said after a moment's thought. Her father was county recorder for 20 years, kept his own copies of everything. Old habit from before the territory established formal record keeping. She inherited all of it when he died. Is she someone who would cooperate? He thought about this with the same deliberateness he brought to other questions. She's someone who was honest when it wasn't convenient for her, he said. Whether that extends to this, I don't know. But I think she deserves to be asked. Evelyn wrote the names in her notebook, Pratt Whitfield. Beneath those, in a column she was beginning to build, the names of other people she'd identified from the records, suppliers whose payments didn't add up. a county official whose name appeared on 3 separate documents she found irregular, the bank manager whose signature authorized the foreclosure notice. One more thing, she said. He waited. The arrangement with Brooks, she said. The letters, the marriage proposal. How long ago did you first start having trouble with the ranch finances? Elias frowned. The debt started becoming unmanageable about 2 years ago, but I'd been seeing signs of it for longer. And when did you first hear that Nathaniel Brooks had a particular interest in this part of the county? In this land specifically? He was quiet for a moment 3 years back, maybe a little more. He bought the Haverford place on the north side, then the Crandall parcel last winter. People said he was assembling land. Assembling it toward what? Waters, he said. The rumor was he wanted to control water access for the whole northern valley. Whoever controls the creek controls everything above and below it. Evelyn looked at the sketch on the table, at the creek, at the 300 yards between her line and his. He needs Broken River Ranch, she said. Not because of the buildings or the livestock or even the grazing land. He needs it because of the creek access your property controls. Without this parcel, the pattern he's been building doesn't connect. She looked up at Elias. Which means the marriage arrangement was not a coincidence, she said. He invited me here for a reason. He wanted someone from his own household on the ground, someone who could manage the appearance of a transition, someone who would be perceived as a neutral party if questions arose about how the property changed hands. When I wrote to him about my work identifying financial manipulation, he realized you'd see it, Elias said. He realized I would see exactly what I've spent the last 8 hours seeing, she said, and he ended the arrangement before I arrived. She closed her notebook. She picked up her coffee, which had gone cold, and drank it anyway. He made one mistake, she said. He didn't think you'd stay. He didn't think I had anywhere else to go, she said. He assumed that a woman who'd been publicly rejected would be too humiliated to do anything but leave as quickly as possible. She set the cup down. He was wrong about that. Elias looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite name, not admiration exactly, which would have felt off between two people who barely knew each other, but something closer to recalibration. The same expression she'd seen yesterday on the road, the sense of him updating his understanding of the situation as new information arrived. When do you want to go to town? He said. This morning, she said. The land office first, then Margaret Whitfield. If you can introduce me. He nodded. I'll hitch the wagon. She gathered her notebook and the pages of cross-references she'd want to carry, folded the sketch carefully and tucked it between the pages of the thinner ledger. She did all of this neatly and quickly, with the practiced efficiency of someone who has worked with documents long enough that handling them well is simply habit. Then she stopped Elias. He turned in the doorway. If Brooks finds out I'm still here, that I'm looking at the records, he'll move faster on the foreclosure. He may try to accelerate whatever he has in the legal pipeline before we have a chance to find the original documents. I know, he said. I'm telling you because it's your ranch, she said. If you want to handle this more quietly, work more slowly. I've been working quietly for 2 years, he said, and I'm still losing it. He looked at her steadily. Let's do this your way. She put on her coat. The county land office was a narrow building wedged between the hardware store and what appeared to have once been a saloon and was now, improbably, a tailor's shop. The clerk at the front desk was a young man named Owen who had the anxious, slightly defensive look of someone who knows his records are not in order and is hoping no one has come to point this out. He was partially right. His records were not in order. But that was not primarily what she'd come for. She asked for the survey records for Broken River Ranch under Elias's name and his father's name. Owen found them in less time than she expected, which meant they were filed in a logical place, which she noted as a point in his favor. The survey on file was the 1,884 document, the one she had already seen a copy of in Elias's records. She examined it carefully, made notes on the specific measurements, the name of the surveyor A. Pratt as expected, and the date of submission to the county. Then she asked for the original deed. Owen went to a different cabinet. He spent longer looking. He came back with a document that she could tell immediately was not the original. The paper was wrong, slightly too bright, without the aging and handling wear that a deed from the 1860s should carry. This is a copy, she said. We keep copies on file, Owen said, for ease of access. Where's the original? The originals are in the archive, the back room. They're not generally available for. I'm not asking to take it, she said. I'd like to examine it. In the back room, if that's how it needs to be done. This gentleman, she indicated, Elias, is the legal property owner of record for this ranch, which gives him the right to examine any documents pertaining to his title. Owen looked at Elias. Elias said nothing and simply looked back, which had a quality of patient immovability that she suspected was quite useful on a working ranch and turned out to be equally useful here. Owen went to get the supervisor. The supervisor was a man in his 50s named Calvert, who had the manner of someone who has held a minor official position long enough to treat it as considerably more significant than it is. He came out from the back and took in the situation with a quick practiced assessment, and his eyes landed on Evelyn with the specific look she had learned to recognize, not hostility exactly, but the preemptive skepticism of a man who has decided, based on the simple fact of her presence, that whatever she wants is probably more trouble than it's worth. "Mr. Carter," he said, addressing Elias entirely, "what seems to be the difficulty?" "I'd like to examine the original deed for Broken River Ranch," Elias said, "and the original survey records, the files we have on record." "Are not originals," Evelyn said. "The deed your clerk provided is a copy on paper that doesn't match the age of an 1863 filing. I'd like to see what you have in the archive." Calvert looked at her. "And you are Evelyn Mercer?" "I'm assisting Mr. Carter with a review of the ranch's property documentation." She had decided, on the wagon ride in, to be accurate rather than complete when describing her role, because accurate and complete were not the same thing, and she had found no legal obligation to be the latter. "A review," Calvert said. "The foreclosure notice received last month creates a time-sensitive need to verify that all county records for this property are in order," she said pleasantly. "I'm sure you'd want the same, given that any irregularities in the public record would reflect on this office rather than on Mr. Carter." The silence that followed had a slightly different texture than the one before it. Calvert took them to the archive. The original deed was there. She found it in the third box, filed behind two documents that had been placed in front of it, with a carelessness that was either innocent or deliberate, and she would not know which until she had more information. She examined it closely under the light from the single high window. The measurements in the deed were clear. The eastern boundary ran to Coulter's Creek. The language was specific to the eastern bank of Coulter's Creek, including riparian rights thereto. She wrote down every measurement. She copied the language about the water rights word for word. Then she looked for the original survey records to correspond with this deed, the pre-1884 surveys. There should have been a survey conducted when the deed was first recorded, and potentially others in the intervening years. They were not in the archive. She looked through every box. She asked Calvert, who said they should be there, who then visibly calculated something behind his eyes, who then said that some older records had been moved to a different location during a reorganization of the office 3 years prior. 3 years prior. She wrote that down too. She thanked Calvert with the same pleasantness she'd opened with, took her copies, and walked out onto the main street of Silver Creek, with Elias beside her and her notebook against her chest. "He knows something," she said, once they were clear of the building. "Calvert? Maybe," Elias said. "Or he knows something's wrong and doesn't want to know more than that. Those aren't the same." "No," she agreed, "they're not." She thought about the reorganization. 3 years ago. The same window in which the foreclosure debt had been manufactured. The original survey records from before 1884 are gone from the county archive, which means whoever altered the 1884 survey also had access to the county records and removed the documents that would have contradicted the new version. "That's not something Greer could do alone," Elias said. "Greer never had any relationship with the county office." "No," she said, "he didn't." They stood on the main street of Silver Creek, and she was aware not for the first time today that they were visible. That Silver Creek was the kind of town where a woman who had arrived publicly and humiliatingly the previous afternoon was still a point of interest, and that interest would reach the wrong people if it hadn't already. She did not let this change her posture or her pace. "Margaret Whitfield," she said, "let's go." Margaret Whitfield lived in a house at the far end of the residential street that ran parallel to the main road, and the house was smaller than the width of its porch suggested from the street. She was perhaps 60, with gray hair pinned efficiently, and the particular composure of a woman who has spent many years managing things for other people, and has arrived at an age where she no longer apologizes for knowing more than she lets on. She recognized Elias immediately. She looked at Evelyn with the frank evaluating attention of someone who asks and answers her own questions simultaneously. "I heard you came in on yesterday's train," she said to Evelyn. "I did," Evelyn said, "and that the Brooks arrangement didn't hold." "It didn't." Margaret studied her for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come in, both of you." The house smelled like old paper and dried herbs, and the front room had more books than furniture, and on one wall there was a full set of shelving that held not books but document boxes, rows of them, labeled in a careful small hand. Evelyn looked at those shelves the way another person might look at a window with a good view. "My father kept copies of everything," Margaret said, following her gaze. "He said the territory's record-keeping was too inconsistent to trust, and he was right." Every deed, every survey, every easement and agreement he processed in 22 years. He cross-filed them by property name and by date. She sat down and looked at them. "What do you need?" Evelyn explained carefully, accurately, without editorializing what she had found in Elias's ledgers and what she had and hadn't found at the county land office. She laid out the manufactured debt, the altered survey, the missing original records, the timing of Greer's false entries against her father's absences. She did not name Nathaniel Brooks. She waited. Margaret was quiet for a long time. "The Crandall parcel," she said finally. "When Brooks bought it last winter, Edna Crandall told me afterward that the sale price had been calculated based on a county land record that didn't match her husband's original deed. The creek boundary was wrong. She noticed it, but her lawyer told her it was a clerical error. Old records, these things happened. She needed the money from the sale and she signed anyway." She looked at Elias. "That's not a coincidence, is it?" "No," Evelyn said. "It isn't." Margaret stood up and went to the shelves. She found the box for Broken River Ranch in less time than it had taken Owen to locate the copies in the county office. She brought it to the table and opened it. Inside were the documents that the county archive no longer had. The original survey from 1863, conducted when Elias's father had first filed for title. A follow-up survey from 1871, after a boundary dispute with a neighboring property had been resolved. Both showed the eastern boundary running to Coulter's Creek. Both showed the water access rights in language identical to the deed. And there was something else. A letter, filed with the 1871 survey, from the county recorder Margaret's father to a territorial land official in Helena. It described an inquiry that had been made about the Broken River property. The inquiry had come from a business representative, unnamed in the letter, asking about the process by which a recorded deed boundary might be amended. Margaret's father had responded, in formal language, that boundary amendments required either the consent of the titled owner or a court order establishing survey error. The letter was dated July 1881, 3 months before the first Meridian Land Holdings payment appeared in Elias's ledgers. Evelyn set the letter on the table between them. Nobody spoke for a moment. "He was planning it even then," Elias said. His voice had gone quiet in a way that had more in it than anger, more than grief even. It was the sound of a person understanding, for the first time, the full span of something that had been done to them. "Your father never knew," Evelyn said. It was not a comforting thing to say. It was simply true, and she thought he deserved truth over comfort. "He died thinking the ranch failed because we mismanaged it," Elias said. "He apologized to me on his deathbed, he apologized." The room was very quiet. Margaret looked at Evelyn. "What do you need from me?" "Copies of these documents," Evelyn said. "Everything that shows the original boundaries, the original surveys, the water rights." And the letter she paused. "And your testimony, if it comes to that. Your father's records speak for themselves, but a court will want to understand the chain of custody, how you received these documents, how they've been maintained, why they're credible." "You're planning to take this to court," Margaret said. "I'm planning to find a lawyer first," Evelyn said. "But yes, I don't see another way to stop the foreclosure and restore the property boundaries through legitimate means. And legitimate means are the only ones that hold." Margaret nodded slowly. She had the expression of someone reaching a decision they've been approaching for some time without knowing it. "There's a man in Helena," she said. "Daniel Forsythe. He handled a land dispute in the Eastern Territory 2 years ago water rights case. He won it." She looked at Evelyn. "He won it against someone with more money and more connections than the family he was representing. He's not afraid of difficult cases." Evelyn wrote the name. It's outside. The afternoon light was shifting, and she could hear the town going about its business through the window, the ordinary sounds of a place that did not yet know what was about to happen in it. She looked at the documents on the table, at the span of years they represented, at the patient and deliberate architecture of what had been done to one family, and was being done to others, property by property, boundary by boundary, water right by water right. She thought about Nathaniel Brooks walking the main street that afternoon, with his easy gait and his space that everyone made for him. She thought about the letter in her coat pocket, still there, still folded. The words "nothing here for you" pressed flat against the lining. He had meant those words as a dismissal. He had no idea they were the beginning of the thing that would undo him. Daniel Forsythe's letter arrived 4 days after Margaret Whitfield sent hers. Evelyn had not been idle in those 4 days. She had used the time the way she used every resource available to her carefully, without waste, with the specific focus of someone who understands that the window between discovery and opposition closing is rarely as wide as you want it to be. She had made 3 additional trips to Margaret's house to work through the document boxes, cross-referencing the historical surveys against the county's current filed records, building a written chronology that placed each falsification in its proper sequence. She had drafted a summary of findings, 12 pages, annotated, with corresponding document references that could be handed to a lawyer or a judge without requiring either to take her word for anything. She had also begun asking quiet questions around Silver Creek. Not in the way of someone conducting an investigation, she was not foolish enough to advertise that openly, but a woman who was new in town, who had been publicly humiliated at the train depot, who was now working at Broken River Ranch in some ambiguous capacity that nobody could quite categorize. That woman could ask questions that seemed like ordinary conversation. She could listen to answers that contained more than the speaker intended. She had spent 9 years in a shipping office learning that the most useful information rarely arrived through formal channels. What she learned in those 4 days confirmed what the ledgers had suggested and added dimensions she hadn't anticipated. Western Capital Associates, the entity behind the manufactured debt, was not a unique arrangement. 2 other ranching families in the county, the Holloways, whose spread sat north of Silver Creek, and an older couple named Fenwick who had sold their land the previous spring under what they described as overwhelming financial pressure, had both referenced, in conversations Evelyn either had directly or heard about indirectly, debts to lending entities they couldn't fully account for. The Holloways were still fighting. The Fenwicks had already lost and moved east. Their land had been purchased at auction by a holding company that Margaret, when Evelyn described it to her, identified without hesitation. "That'll be one of Brooks's," Margaret said. "He never buys directly when he can buy through a layer." The pattern was larger than Broken River Ranch. Evelyn had known this was possible from the moment she'd mapped the Meridian Land Holdings payments, but knowing a thing is possible and confirming that it is actual are different, and the confirmation settled something cold in her chest that had nothing to do with the Montana autumn. He had done this to multiple families. He had taken years doing it. He had been careful and patient, and he had used people's trust against them. Foremen, surveyors, county officials, bank clerks, and he had constructed something that from any single angle looked like ordinary financial misfortune. But from above, from the elevation she now occupied with her 12 pages of notes, looked exactly like what it was. She was thinking about all of this when Elias came in from the yard with the letter. He handed it to her without reading it himself, which told her something she filed away without examining too closely. He was treating this as her domain. Not because it wasn't his ranch, but because she had demonstrated a competence he respected enough to follow, which was not something she had encountered often from men, and which she was not entirely sure how to account for. She opened the letter. Daniel Forsythe wrote the way she imagined he argued directly, without preamble, with the specific economy of someone who bills by the hour and has learned to value his own time. He had reviewed the summary she and Margaret had sent. He believed the case had merit. He was prepared to take it on contingency, meaning his fee would come from damages awarded rather than up front, which told her he was confident enough in the evidence to risk his own investment. He would be in Silver Creek in 6 days, arriving on the Thursday morning train. He wanted to meet with her and with Elias and to examine the original documents in Margaret's possession. He also wrote, in the letter's final paragraph, something that she read twice. "I should inform you that I am aware of Nathaniel Brooks by reputation. He has previously been the subject of inquiry in 2 separate territorial matters that did not proceed to formal action. The individuals who initiated those inquiries subsequently found their local circumstances sufficiently complicated that they chose not to continue. I raise this not to discourage you, but to ensure you understand what you are likely to face. A man who has survived 2 prior examinations has learned something about how to respond to a third." She folded the letter. "He's coming," she said. Elias, who had been waiting by the door, simply nodded. "Good. He says Brooks has been investigated before." Both times, the people who started the investigation stopped. Elias looked at her. "Stopped how?" "He doesn't specify." She put the letter in her notebook. "I think that's intentional. He's warning us without scaring us off. Are you scared off?" She thought about this honestly, which she believed the question deserved. She was not reckless. She had never been the kind of person who confused courage with the absence of fear, and she was not going to start now. She was aware that what she was doing had consequences she could not fully predict, and that the man she was doing it against had resources she did not have, and experience she lacked. "No," she said. "But I'm not going to pretend there's no risk." He nodded once, as if this was the answer he had expected and the one he preferred. Then he went back out to the yard, and she went back to her notes. She found Aldous Pratt on a Wednesday 2 days before Forsythe was due to arrive. She had been thinking about how to approach him since the first night, since she'd written his name in the margin of her notebook, and understood what his role in this had been. A surveyor who falsifies a property boundary is not the architect of the scheme, he is the tool of it. That meant he was, in Evelyn's experience, one of two things: a willing participant who had been compensated and was now protecting his investment, or a man who had been maneuvered into something and had spent the intervening years hoping it would never surface. The distinction mattered. You approached those two types of person completely differently. She found him at his office, which occupied the ground floor of a building on the western end of the main street, its sign weathered to the point where the word "Servior" was more suggested than legible. The office smelled like damp paper and pipe smoke, and Pratt himself was a narrow man of perhaps 55 who went from a relaxed, professional expression to something considerably less composed the moment she said the words "Broken River Ranch." He did not ask her to leave. That was the first thing she noted. A man who had done something and felt no ambivalence about it would have asked her to leave. Instead, he went very still, the way animals go still when they calculate whether they are safer moving or not moving. "I'm not here to threaten you," she said, which was the truth. "Then what are you here for?" His voice was controlled but thin. "I want to understand what happened," she said. "I've seen the 1,884 survey. I've also seen the original 1,863 and 1,871 surveys from the county recorder's private archive. The measurements don't correspond. Someone altered the eastern boundary by approximately 300 yards. She looked at him steadily. "I think you know that." He looked at the window. Not at her, not at the door at the window, which was a particular kind of look. The look of someone deciding how much of a cage they are actually in. "The statute of limitations on survey fraud in this territory," he began. "I'm not a lawyer," she said. "I'm not here about statutes. I'm here because what was done to Broken River Ranch is being done to other families, and it won't stop until someone explains how it was done." She paused. "You weren't the one who planned this. That much is obvious from what I've read. Someone came to you with a specific request and a specific amount of money, and you made a decision that I imagine you have thought about more than once since." Something shifted in his face. It was very small, but she had spent 9 years reading numbers and the people who kept them, and she recognized it. "He said it was a boundary correction," Pratt said. His voice had gone flat and careful, that the original survey had been in error and the county records needed updating. He had a letter appeared official, county office letterhead. "Who gave you the letter?" He hesitated. "A man called Mercer. Said he represented a land management company. Western something. Western Capital Associates, the same entity behind the manufactured loan." She kept her expression neutral. "He paid you," she said. It was not a question, and she did not make it one. Pratt looked at his desk. "He paid me to conduct a new survey and submit it to the county as a correction of record." He said the owner had been informed. He said it was a formal process. A pause. "I should have verified that with the owner directly. I knew it at the time, and I didn't. Why not?" He looked up at her then. His eyes had the specific quality of a person who has rehearsed an excuse for so long that they no longer believe it themselves. "'Cause the money was significant, and I had debts of my own, and I told myself the letter was real." She let this sit in the air between them for a moment. Not cruelly, she was not trying to punish him, and she understood, more than she might have admitted aloud, the particular arithmetic of a person who makes a wrong decision because the right one is too expensive. She had seen it in Boston in the accounts of ordinary people. Need was a powerful editor of judgment. "I need you to write down what you've told me," she said. "A statement. Your account of what happened, who approached you, what you were told, what you were paid, what you did. Signed and dated." He stared at her. "If I do that." "If you do that," she said, "the statement establishes that you were misled about the legitimacy of the process. That you were used as an instrument of a larger fraud rather than its originator. That distinction matters both legally and practically." She leaned forward slightly. "If you don't do that, and this reaches a court, which it is going to do, Mr. Pratt, with or without your cooperation, then the only version of your role that exists is the one visible in the county records, which shows your name on a fraudulent survey with no context." He was quiet for a long time. She waited. She had learned in 9 years that the thing most people needed before they made a difficult decision was simply to be allowed to be quiet for a moment without someone filling the silence for them. "If I sign something," he said finally, "he'll know." "Yes," she said, "he probably will, eventually." That's not, he stopped. Started again. "You don't know what he's like." "I'm beginning to," she said. He doesn't respond to things the way ordinary people do. He doesn't argue. He doesn't threaten directly." Pratt's hands were flat on the desk, and she could see the effort he was making to keep them still. Things get difficult. For people who cause him problems. Their credit at the bank, their contracts. He stopped again. "Their arrangements get canceled," she said quietly, without explanation. He looked at her. He understood, she could tell, that she knew something about that from her own experience. "I can't protect you from all of it," she said. I won't pretend I can. But I can tell you that a signed statement given to a lawyer in a formal legal proceeding is considerably harder to make disappear than an unofficial arrangement made in a surveyor's office. Once it exists in the legal record, it exists. That offers a kind of protection that silence doesn't. Another long silence. Then Pratt opened his desk drawer and took out a sheet of paper. She stayed while he wrote it. She did not read over his shoulder or suggest his phrasing the statement needed to be his, in his words, or it would look coached in court. She sat in the chair against the wall and looked at the ceiling and thought about the next problem, which was Greer, and how to find him, and how to approach a man who had betrayed an employer he'd worked for over a decade and who was now, presumably, living with the particular weight of that. When Pratt finished, he pushed the paper across the desk. She read it. It was accurate to what he'd told her and specific enough to be useful. She asked him to add one detail, the approximate amount he'd been paid, which was the kind of specific fact that makes a document credible in ways that generalities don't. He added it. He signed it. She signed as witness. She folded it and put it in her notebook. "Thank you," she said. He did not respond. She did not press him on it. She put on her coat and left, and she walked back toward the ranch wagon, feeling the weight of that folded paper as though it were something considerably heavier than it was. Greer was harder. She had expected that. A man who had falsified records for a rancher he'd worked alongside for 11 years, who had watched that rancher's son struggle with a financial collapse he himself had helped engineer, and who had then left 8 months after the rancher's death. That man was not going to be easy to find, and finding him was not going to make the conversation simple. Elias told her, without her having to ask more than once, that Greer had gone north after leaving the ranch. A place called Dunmore, a smaller settlement 2 hours ride up the valley. He had family there, a sister, Elias thought, or possibly a cousin. He had not been in contact with Elias since leaving. He had not sent word when Elias's father died, which was the thing Evelyn noticed, that Elias mentioned last and with the flattest voice. She asked Elias to take her to Dunmore. He asked if she was sure she wanted him there for the conversation, meaning whether his presence would help or complicate it. She thought about this. A man who had betrayed the Carter family's trust would find facing Elias difficult, possibly paralyzing. But his absence might make Greer feel safer than he should, and safe men sometimes said less. "Come," she said, "but let me begin it." They rode out on a gray morning, and Dunmore turned out to be less a settlement than a scattering of buildings that had accumulated around a feed store and a water well without ever committing fully to being a town. Greer's sister's house was on the northern edge of it, identified by a neighbor who looked at them with the mild, incurious attention of someone who has learned that strangers come and go, and it is rarely worth forming an opinion about them. Greer answered the door himself. He was a broad man, 60 or near it, with the kind of physicality that had once been strength and was now something softer, as though the effort of being that solid had begun to cost more than he was willing to pay. He recognized Elias immediately. She watched the recognition move through him, first the face, then the shoulders, then the hands, which came up slightly at his sides before he controlled them. He did not look at her at first. His eyes were entirely on Elias. "Elias," he said. His voice was rough and gave nothing away. "What are you doing up here?" "I came with Miss Mercer," Elias said. "She has some questions about the ranch accounts." Greer looked at her then. She saw him take her in a woman he didn't know, traveling with a man whose family he had wronged, arriving unannounced at his door. She saw him calculate the way people calculate when they realize a thing they have been waiting for has finally arrived and is standing on their porch. "You'd better come in," he said. The inside of the house was tidy in the way of a person who lives alone and has imposed order as a substitute for company. A fire was going. There were 3 chairs, and they took 2 of them, and Greer sat in the third and looked at his hands. Evelyn opened her notebook. She did not make a production of it. She simply it and said, "I've been going through the financial records for Broken River Ranch. I want to ask you about the payments to Meridian Land Holdings." He was very still. "I've identified at least 14 ledger entries in your handwriting," she said. "The dates correspond to periods when Elias's father was away from the ranch. The payments went to an entity that appears to have no legitimate business relationship with the ranch. I've also found a separate set of entries recording repayments to Western Capital Associates for a loan I can find no originating documentation for in the ranch's files." Greer said nothing. "I'm not asking whether you did this," she said. "The records establish that. What I want to understand is how it happened. Who came to you, what they told you, what they offered, and what happened when you tried to stop, if you did try to stop." Something moved through him when she said that last part. She had included it deliberately, on instinct, because she had read those ledger entries carefully, enough to notice something. The entries became less regular in the final 18 months before Greer left the ranch. The handwriting in those later entries was less clean. Someone who falsifies records with confidence writes neatly because they are not afraid of what they're doing. Someone who is writing something they have begun to regret writes differently, a little faster, a little less even, as if they are trying to get through it before they lose the nerve to continue. The silence went on long enough that Elias shifted in his chair. Evelyn put a hand up slightly, not toward Elias. Just a small gesture, don't, and he stilled. He told me it was temporary, Greer said. His voice came out lower than he'd started the sentence aiming for, and he cleared his throat. Mercer, the one who came to me the first time. He said your father was in a financial arrangement he couldn't discuss openly, that the payments needed to go through the books in a particular way, for legal reasons he couldn't explain to me, that it would be sorted out within the year. He stopped. I believed him because I didn't think someone would lie that specifically. You think a lie has to be big to work, but the specific ones are harder to challenge. When did you understand what was actually happening? Ellen said. About 2 years in. His jaw tightened. When your father came back from Helena that second time, and he looked at the ledgers and he was confused. He came to me and asked about the Meridian payments, and I started again. I told him it was an administrative expense, that it was something his lawyer had arranged. He was ill. He trusted me. He accepted it. The room was quiet. The fire made small sounds. After that, he said, I understood what it was. But by then I'd been making entries for 2 years, and the money was real, and my role was documented in the books, and I didn't see a way out that didn't end with me in the worst position of anyone. So you kept going, Evelyn said. Not with judgment, just with accuracy. I kept going, he said, until he died. And then I left. Because I couldn't look at Elias and keep doing it. Elias had been very quiet through all of this. She glanced at him now. His face was composed in the way that required effort, the tight, deliberate composure of a person deciding to stay in the chair rather than stand up and do something with the feeling that is looking for somewhere to go. She gave him a moment. Then she turned back to Greer. I need you to write a statement, she said. Everything you've told me. The name Mercer, what you were told. What you did and why. The dates as specifically as you can remember them. She paused. And I need you to name who Mercer represented. Who was actually behind this. Greer looked at her. You know who it was. For a legal proceeding, she said. I need you to say it. Another long silence. Nathaniel Brooks, Greer said. Mercer was one of his men. He said it himself, the third time he came to the ranch. Said I was working for Mr. Brooks's interests, and that Mr. Brooks took care of people who worked for his interests. A pause. And of course ruined people who stopped. Did he threaten you directly? He didn't have to. He described what had happened to a man in the Eastern Territory who had backed out of an arrangement with Mr. Brooks. The description was detailed enough to serve as a threat without being one. She wrote this down. She wrote all of it down. Will you sign a statement, she said. Greer looked at Elias for a long moment. Elias met his eyes. Nothing passed between them that Evelyn could have put into words, but something passed. The particular communication of people who have a long history that contains both trust and its violation, and haven't found the accounting for it yet. Yes, Greer said, I'll sign. She gave him paper from her notebook. She told him to write in his own words, his own order. She went to stand by the window while he wrote, because she thought he needed not to be watched doing it, and because she needed a moment herself. Outside, the valley stretched away in both directions, gray and enormous under the overcast sky. She thought about the architecture of what Brooks had built, not just the financial structure, which was intricate enough, but the human structure beneath it. The Pratts and the Greers and the Owens and the Calverts. Each one offered something they needed, or threatened with something they feared. Each one a small, necessary piece of a machine that was designed to be invisible from the inside. The machine worked because it used people's ordinary human failings against them. Debt, fear, trust misplaced in an official-looking letter. The desire to believe that what you were doing was not as bad as you were afraid it was. She was not above any of these things herself. She knew that. She had spent the last several days operating on a combination of anger and focus that she understood would not last indefinitely, and she was careful not to mistake it for something more permanent than it was. When Greer finished, she read the statement. It was more thorough than Pratt's. He had been involved longer and remembered more, and the writing had a quality of someone unburdening rather than simply recording. She asked him to add 3 specific details she needed for the legal timeline. He added them. He signed. She signed as witness. She put the statement with Pratt's in her notebook. They drove back to Silver Creek, mostly in silence. Somewhere in the middle of the road, Elias said, he was with the ranch 11 years. It was not a question and not quite a statement. She understood it as an expression of the particular grief of discovering that duration of loyalty doesn't predict the content of it. He's on the right side of it now, she said. Now, Elias said. That's the only now there is, she said, which was not a comfort exactly. But it was true, and she thought he was someone who preferred true over comforting. He didn't say anything else. She didn't either. The horses moved through the valley, and the afternoon began to go gray at its edges, and she thought about Daniel Forsythe arriving in 2 days, and what she would hand him, and what the next step after that would look like. Brooks moved on the 3rd day. She had expected something. Forsythe's letter had warned her, and she had her own instincts about how a careful man behaved when he sensed a perimeter being approached. She had deliberately made certain parts of her investigation visible, not the documents, not the statements, but the fact of an investigation. She had asked questions in Silver Creek that would circle back to people who would mention them, to people who would eventually mention them to someone in Brooks's circle. She had done this on purpose. A man who does not know he is being investigated continues as normal. A man who knows he is being investigated makes choices, and choices leave marks. She just hadn't anticipated the form it would take. The notice arrived at Broken River Ranch by courier on a Thursday morning, a formal legal notice from the Territorial Bank, signed by the bank manager Harlan Cole, accelerating the foreclosure timeline. The original notice had given Elias 60 days. The new notice gave him 17. Walt, the older ranch hand, brought it to the breakfast table with the expression of a man delivering news that he wishes he could put back where he found it. Evelyn read it twice, then she looked at the date 2 days ago, filed before Forsythe had even arrived in Silver Creek. "He knows we're moving," she said. Elias read the notice. His expression did not change much, but she could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the mental arithmetic of 17 days versus what they had and what they still needed. "Can Forsythe do anything about this?" he asked. "He can file for a stay pending the territorial court hearing," she said. "If the evidence is strong enough, a judge can freeze the foreclosure while the underlying fraud is investigated. That's our first priority when Forsythe gets here tomorrow. And if the judge doesn't grant the stay?" She did not answer immediately, because the honest answer was that she didn't know. And she had decided early in this that honesty about the limits of her knowledge served him better than false confidence. "Then we find another way," she said. "But let's give Forsythe the chance to do his job before we start planning for that." She spent the day preparing Forsythe's package, the 12-page summary, the document copies Margaret had provided, Pratt's statement, Greer's statement, the chronological timeline, and a separate section she had drafted analyzing the pattern of acquisitions that pointed to the larger scheme beyond Broken River Ranch. She organized everything by date, by document type, and by relevance to the specific legal claims which she had outlined based on everything she'd read about property law in the territorial codebooks she'd borrowed from Margaret's shelves. She was not a lawyer, she knew that. But she had spent 9 years making information legible to people who needed to make decisions. And she understood that a lawyer arriving to an organized case is considerably more effective than one arriving to a pile of raw material. That evening she sat on the porch of Broken River Ranch with a cup of cold coffee and the accelerated foreclosure notice in her hand and thought about Brooks. Not strategically, not tactically, just him. The shape of him as she was coming to understand it through his choices. The patience, the willingness to spend years building something. The particular cruelty of using people's trust and need as instruments rather than simply taking things by force. Force was at least honest. What he did was something else. It borrowed the appearance of legitimacy, used the systems people depended on, and left the damage looking like an accident. She thought about the 2 prior investigations Forsythe had mentioned, the people who had started them and stopped. She thought about what circumstances became sufficiently complicated, actually meant for a family with a ranch to protect, or a business to sustain, or children to feed. She thought about the fact that she had none of those things. She had $11.30, now somewhat reduced. She had a borrowed room and borrowed document boxes and 2 signed statements in her notebook. She had no property in Silver Creek, no business, no family within 2,000 miles. She had no credit at the local bank, no contracts to threaten. No arrangements that could be complicated. Brooks had canceled his arrangement with her before she arrived. He had, in the most precise sense possible, left her with nothing to lose. She folded the foreclosure notice and put it in her coat pocket alongside his rejection letter that she had not yet thrown away. 2 documents, she thought, with a dry humor that surprised her slightly, that she was accumulating quite a correspondence from Nathaniel Brooks for someone he had supposedly dismissed. The Montana night came on fast and cold, the way it did at this elevation in autumn, and the stars appeared with the sudden certainty of something that had always been there, and was simply waiting for the light to clear. She went inside. She had work to do before morning. Forsythe arrived on the Friday train, and he was not what she had built in her mind during the days of waiting. She had imagined a lawyer who would manage the situation, a professional who would take her evidence and carry it forward and tell her where she was needed and where she was not. What arrived instead was a man of about 45 who moved quickly, asked better questions than she'd expected, and had the particular qualities she associated with people who have spent a long time in adversarial situations, an economy of expression that conserved energy for the moments that actually required it. He shook her hand. He shook Elias's hand. He looked at the notebook she handed him for approximately 90 seconds, long enough to understand its organization. Not long enough to read more than the first page, and he said, "How long did this take you?" "6 days," she said. He looked at her over the notebook. "You had the original documents?" "Access to them through Margaret Whitfield's archive. The copies are in the second section." He opened to the second section. He read for longer this time. He turned to the Pratt statement, then to the Greer statement. His expression throughout was professionally neutral, but she had become attentive to small signals in the past week, and she could see something in the set of his jaw that she interpreted as someone finding the material stronger than they had prepared themselves to find it. "The stay," she said, given the accelerated foreclosure notice. "Yes," he said without looking up. "Today." He was in town for 3 hours before he filed the emergency application for a stay with the Territorial Court Representative in Silver Creek, a part-time position held by a man named Cooper, who operated primarily out of the same building as the Justice of the Peace, and who, Evelyn was relieved to discover, appeared to have no particular relationship with Brooks or his associates. Cooper read the application. He read the supporting summary. He asked Forsythe 2 questions, both procedural. He stamped the application and told them a response from the Territorial Court in Helena would be expected within 5 to 7 days. Forsythe came back to where she and Elias were waiting in the street. He looked at Evelyn. "Cooper will forward it today," he said. "Helena should have it by Monday. If Healy is on the circuit, he was already calculating. He's a fair judge. Not friendly to either side, which is what we want." "What are our odds?" Elias asked. Forsythe looked at him, then at Evelyn. "With what she's built? Better than they should be for a case this fast." He paused. "But Brooks will respond. He always does. And his responses have historically been effective." "What kind of response?" she asked. "He'll challenge the credibility of every witness. Pratt's professional reputation. Greer's character, given that he's admitted to falsifying records. He'll argue that Miss Mercer has a personal grievance against him, and that this has colored the investigation." He looked at her steadily. "He will make the case that you are a rejected woman who found a sympathetic rancher and invented a conspiracy to damage the man who turned her away." She had known this was coming. She had known it with the same certainty that she had known, on the train platform 6 days ago, that the letter in her hand was not the whole story. "Then we make sure there is nothing about this investigation that can be characterized as anything other than what it is," she said. "Every step documented, every finding verifiable through primary sources, every witness speaking to what they directly observed and nothing beyond that." Forsythe looked at her for a moment. "That's exactly right," he said. "Then let's go over everything," she said. "From the beginning. I want to make sure you have what you need, and I haven't missed anything that he can use against us." They worked until the sun was gone. Forsythe left that evening on the last available conveyance back toward the hotel in town, with her 12-page summary, the supporting documents, and both statements in a leather case he treated with the careful attention of someone who understood that what he was carrying was the difference between a family keeping their land and losing it. Elias walked her back from the point where they'd said goodbye to Forsythe, and they went back to the ranch in the particular quiet of 2 people who have been through a great deal together in a short time and have not yet found the language for what that means. At the door he stopped. "Evelyn," he said. He used her name, which he did not do frequently. She waited. "Whatever happens with this," he said, "whatever Healy decides, you should know that what you've done here, the way you did it." He stopped. He was not, she had observed, a man who gave speeches or looked for occasions to express things. He said what he said, and then he was done. "Thank you," he said. That was all. She looked at him in the low light from the lamp inside the door. He was tired. She was tired. They were 2 imperfect people who had found each other at the intersection of her disaster and his, and they had done something together that neither of them could have done alone, and now they were standing at a door in Montana in the autumn dark, waiting to find out if it would be enough. "We're not done yet," she said. "No," he said, "we're not." She went inside. She did not go to sleep for a long time. The stay came through on a Tuesday. Cooper delivered it himself, which Evelyn took as a signal that even a part-time Territorial Court representative understood the weight of what he was carrying. He rode out to Broken River Ranch in the early afternoon and handed the document to Elias on the porch, and Elias brought it inside to where Evelyn was working at the study table, and she read it without standing up. Judge Amos Healy had granted the emergency stay. The foreclosure proceedings against Broken River Ranch were frozen pending a full hearing in Helena. The hearing was set for 19 days out. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the table and looked at the wall for a moment, which was something she did when she needed to let a fact settle before she responded to it. Helena, Elias said. He had read it over her shoulder. Helena, she said. 19 days was not a long time to prepare for a territorial court hearing against a man who had spent years building something designed to be legally invisible. But it was 19 days more than they'd had on Thursday morning when the accelerated foreclosure notice arrived, and she had learned in the past 10 days to treat time as exactly what it was: not generous, not cruel, simply finite, and to use it accordingly. She sent word to Forsythe that afternoon. His response arrived the next morning, and it was characteristic of him. 3 short paragraphs, dense with specific instruction. He wanted to meet in Silver Creek on Friday to review the full case package. He had already begun drafting the petition to the territorial court that would formally challenge the fraudulent survey, the manufactured debt, and the pattern of corruption across multiple properties. He needed 2 things from her before Friday: a complete written account of her own process, how she had found the documents, how she had identified the falsifications, what her professional background was that qualified her to make these determinations, and any additional evidence of the broader pattern beyond Broken River Ranch. The second request she was already prepared for. She had the notes on the Holloway family and the Fenwicks. She had Margaret's knowledge of at least 2 other properties whose county records had shown suspicious boundary amendments in the past 5 years. She had a pattern. The first request was harder. She sat down that evening to write her own account, and she found it more difficult than she had anticipated. Not because the facts were complicated, she knew them precisely, but because writing about herself required a different kind of honesty than writing about ledger entries. The ledger entries were simply true or false. Her account of herself had to be accurate without being either modest to the point of uselessness or inflated to the point of dishonesty, and she was more comfortable with other people's numbers than with her own story. She wrote it anyway. 3 drafts before she had something she was willing to show Forsythe. 9 years at her uncle's firm. The specific nature of her work: accounts management, expense verification, fraud identification. The 4 instances of deliberate manipulation she had found and documented. The professional reputation she had built in a position that had been given to her reluctantly and held through demonstrated results. She wrote about coming to Montana because the court would need to understand her presence in Silver Creek, and she was not going to leave that story to Brooks's version of it. She wrote about the rejection letter, about the decision to stay, about Elias offering her a room, and the conditions under which she had examined the ranch's records. She wrote it plainly, without editorializing, and she let the facts make the case rather than her feelings about them, because she understood instinctively what Forsythe had told her explicitly. Brooks would try to make this about her emotions, and the best counter to that was a record so factual it offered nothing to attack. She finished at 11 o'clock at night. She read it back once, changed 2 words, and put it in the case file. The Harvest Festival was Brooks's idea. She learned this from Percy, the young ranch hand, who heard it from someone in town, who had heard it from the woman who organized the event annually. Brooks had approached her 2 weeks prior, well before the stay had been filed, which meant before he knew Evelyn was still in Silver Creek, and offered to sponsor the festival this year. Pay for the music, the food, the lanterns. His name would be on the announcement. It was, she recognized immediately, a public relations strategy. A man who knows an investigation is coming and cannot stop it at the document level, attempts to control the social environment instead. Put his name on something the town valued. Stand in the center of a festive crowd and be seen as a benefactor. Make himself the landscape rather than a figure moving through it. She understood this because she had seen a version of it in Boston, not land fraud, but a different category of financial misconduct. And the man responsible had donated substantially to a hospital in the weeks before his accounts were examined. The donation had not protected him, but it had complicated the social response to his exposure. The festival was scheduled for Saturday. Forsythe's meeting was Friday. She considered the timing and decided it was not a coincidence. Elias, when she explained her thinking, looked at the middle distance for a moment and then said, "He wants to be surrounded by people who like him before the story changes." "Yes," she said. "Are you going?" She thought about it. She thought about what it would look like: the woman from the train platform, the rejected Boston bride, appearing at a public gathering in Silver Creek while a legal proceeding against the town's most prominent citizen was in motion. She thought about what Brooks would do with that image if she attended, and she thought about what her absence would signal, which was retreat. And retreat was a kind of message she was not prepared to send. "Yes," she said, "we're going." Elias did not argue. He simply nodded in the manner of a man who had decided some days ago to follow her lead on the questions that fell within her domain, and this was clearly one of them. Friday's meeting with Forsythe was 4 hours long and left her with 2 pages of additional notes and a revised understanding of where the vulnerabilities in their case were. Forsythe was honest about those vulnerabilities which she respected. The strongest element they had was the documentary evidence. Margaret's archive against the county's current records was a clean, demonstrable contradiction that did not depend on anyone's testimony. The weakest element was the chain connecting Brooks directly to the fraud. Pratt had named Mercer. Greer had named Mercer and connected him to Brooks by direct statement. But Mercer himself, wherever he was, had not been located, and Brooks's name appeared on no document in their possession. His insulation was deliberate and thorough. He'll claim Mercer was acting independently, Forsythe said, that he had no knowledge of what Mercer did in his name, that he is himself a victim of an overzealous associate. Will that work? Elias asked. With a weak case it might, Forsythe said. With what we have the pattern across multiple properties, the timing, the access to county records that required either official position or significant influence, it becomes harder to sustain. The argument requires a jury or a judge to believe that all of this happened adjacent to Brooks, without his knowledge or direction. He looked at the document spread across Margaret's table, where they had convened. Healy is not a stupid man. What does he need to rule against Brooks directly? Evelyn asked. Ideally, something that connects Brooks to the mechanism. A letter, a payment record in his name. A witness who interacted with him personally rather than through Mercer. He paused. Barring that, the pattern itself is the argument. A man in whose orbit these things consistently happen, across multiple properties over multiple years, always to his financial benefit. That pattern is itself a form of evidence. She thought about the bank, about Harlan Cole, whose signature was on the foreclosure notice. Cole was not in their documents. As a knowing participant, he might be a man who processed paperwork without examining it closely, or he might be something worse. Either way, the bank's records would contain the loan origination documents for Western Capital Associates, the ones missing from Elias's files. The bank record, she said. If the court can compel the bank to produce the originating loan documents for Western Capital Associates. I've already drafted that subpoena, Forsythe said. Cole will receive it Monday. He'll go to Brooks, Elias said. Yes, Forsythe said. And Brooks will either instruct him to produce documents that incriminate them both, or he'll instruct him to claim the documents don't exist, or he'll instruct him to produce fabricated documents. He looked around the table. Any of those 3 responses tells us something useful. The meeting broke up in the late afternoon. Evelyn walked back to where the ranch wagon was hitched, with the specific tiredness of someone who has been at high concentration for 4 hours, and whose body has been waiting patiently to register its protest. Elias drove. She looked at the road and thought about Cole, about what it meant to be the bank manager who signed foreclosure notices on properties whose debt had been manufactured, and whether that made you complicit or simply careless. She thought about the difference between the two, and how a court would evaluate it. She thought about tomorrow, about Brooks standing in the center of a festival crowd with his name on the lanterns. There's something I haven't told you, she said. Elias looked at her sideways. He didn't just invite me to Montana to have someone in the household during the transition, she said. I've been thinking about it more carefully. I think there was a second reason. What reason? A woman who arrives as a mail-order bride and then becomes the wife of the man purchasing a ranch. She becomes a character in the story of how the ranch changed hands. A respectable narrative. A domestic one. Not a financial acquisition facilitated by fraud, but a family arriving, starting fresh on land that had been properly sold. She paused. He needed a face for it. Someone who would make the transition look like something other than what it was. Elias was quiet for a moment. He was going to use you as cover. I think so. And when I told him in my letter what I was capable of seeing, he realized the cover would see through itself. She looked at the road. He's a careful man. I keep reminding myself of that. Tomorrow he won't do anything impulsive. He'll be measured. He'll be charming. And whatever he says will be calculated to serve a purpose. Then we need to be more prepared than he is, Elias said. Yes, she said, we do. The Harvest Festival occupied the 2 blocks of Silver Creek's Main Street that the town treated as its civic center, the space in front of the general store and the assay office and the small building that served as a meeting hall. By the time Evelyn and Elias arrived on Saturday evening, the lanterns were lit and the crowd was the size that a town of Silver Creek's dimensions could generate when it had a reason to be outside together. Brooks was there. She saw him within 30 seconds of arriving, which she suspected was approximately how long it took him to see her, because she watched his attention shift not dramatically, not with the obvious recalibration of a man surprised, but with the small, precise adjustment of someone who has spotted an unexpected variable and is already calculating its implications. He was standing with 3 men she didn't know, and a woman in an expensive dress who stood at his left shoulder with the particular posture of someone who had learned to occupy that position. He did not come toward her. He simply looked for a moment, and then he returned his attention to the men he was talking with, and his expression resumed whatever it had been before she arrived. She understood this as strategy. He was not going to approach her. He was going to let the crowd see him as undisturbed and let her be the one who seemed agitated, if she seemed agitated, which she did not intend to. She got a cup of cider from the table near the meeting hall and stood with it and watched the crowd, and she let the crowd watch her. Margaret Whitfield found her within 10 minutes. Then the woman from the assay office, whose name she'd learned 2 days prior, Clara Hodge, whose husband had lost a grazing lease the previous year in circumstances that Clara had described, when asked, as confusing. The Holloways came, and Evelyn had met them briefly the week before, when she'd gone to gather information about their situation, and they stood close and spoke quietly. She was not, she realized, as isolated in Silver Creek as she had been on the first day. The 11 days she'd spent working had moved her, in the social geography of the town, from the woman who had failed publicly at the depot to something that did not yet have a clean name, but that people were orienting toward with a kind of attention that was different from the curiosity of her first afternoon. She did not mistake this for safety. Social sympathy was not legal protection, and it was not, in a town where Brooks held significant financial relationships, unconditional, but it was something. She was talking with Margaret and Clara when she became aware of a shift in the crowd's attention, that particular ripple that moves through a group of people when something is happening that they didn't collectively plan for. She turned. Brooks had moved to the center of the cleared space in front of the meeting hall. Someone had given him an elevated position, a small platform, the kind used for announcements, and he was standing on it with the easy authority of a man who has spent a great deal of his life being listened to and has no reason to expect this occasion to be different. He thanked people. He said the right things about community, about the season, about Silver Creek's future. His voice was good, not theatrical, which would have been too much, but warm and measured and calibrated to sound like a man who meant what he said. She stood in the crowd and listened, and noted every word with the same attention she brought to ledger entries. Then he stopped thanking and started doing something else. It was subtle. It was, she recognized immediately, the most dangerous kind of public attack, the one that doesn't look like an attack. He talked about the challenges facing Silver Creek, about outside interests that did not understand the territory, about people who arrived with agendas formed before they had any real knowledge of the place. He talked about the importance of established relationships, of trust built over years, of the danger of allowing temporary visitors to disrupt what the community had built together. He did not say her name. He did not look at her. He didn't need to. She could feel the crowd's attention like a physical thing. The people near her who glanced in her direction, quick and then away. The people farther back who were watching both the platform and the area where she stood, reading the room the way crowds read rooms. Margaret touched her arm lightly. He's trying to make you look like a troublemaker before you have a chance to say anything. I know, Evelyn said. She did not move. She held her cider and she stood exactly where she was, and she let him finish. When he stepped down from the platform and people began to shift and reform around him, she made a decision. She handed her cup to Margaret. She said, "Excuse me," and she walked toward him through the crowd with the direct and unhurried pace of someone who knows exactly where she is going and has no uncertainty about her right to be there. The crowd parted. Not quickly, not theatrically, but it parted. She stopped 3 feet from him. He had seen her coming and had not backed away, which she had expected. He was too controlled for visible retreat. He looked at her with an expression that was politely, professionally neutral, and he said, "Miss Mercer." "Mr. Brooks," she said. The people immediately around them had gone quiet in the way that crowds go quiet when they recognize that something real is happening in front of them. "I hope you found Silver Creek hospitable," he said in the tone of a man making pleasant conversation, "despite the difficulties of your arrival." "I have," she said. "The people here have been generous." She let that sit for exactly 1 beat. "I've spent the last 11 days reviewing the financial records for Broken River Ranch. I thought you should know, if you don't already, that the review has been thorough." Something moved across his face. Very small, she almost missed it. "I'm not certain what that has to do with me," he said. "The records document payments to Meridian Land Holdings over a period of 4 years," she said, clearly and without heat. "They document loan repayments to Western Capital Associates for a loan with no originating paperwork in the ranch's files. They document a property survey filed in 9884 that contradicts the deed measurements and the original surveys on file in the county recorder's private archive. She paused. A lawyer named Daniel Forsythe has filed a petition with the territorial court in Helena. There will be a hearing before Judge Healy in 17 days. The silence around them had expanded. She was aware of how many people were now listening without pretending not to. Brooks smiled. It was a good smile practiced without being visible as practiced, pleasant without being warm. Miss Mercer, he said, I'm aware that you came to Montana under difficult circumstances. I'm sorry the arrangement between us didn't work out as planned, but I'd encourage you to be careful about making public claims that. I'm not making claims, she said. I'm describing documents. The documents make the claims. The signed statements from Aldous Pratt and the former foreman Greer make claims. I simply read what they wrote. The smile did not leave his face, but the quality of it changed in a way that only someone looking directly at him would notice. A rejected woman, he said, and his voice was still pleasant, conversational, designed to be heard by the people around them without sounding like what it was, working alongside a rancher who faces financial ruin, building a case that conveniently targets the man who declined to marry her. I think most reasonable people would see the motivation there. She had known this was coming. She had known it in Forsythe's office. She had known it on the wagon ride home. She had known it in the 3 drafts of her written account. She had prepared for it the only way she knew how, by making it irrelevant. Yes, she said, I was rejected. And I stayed, and I looked at the records, and the records are what they are regardless of my feelings about any of it. She held his gaze steadily. Pratt's statement is what it is regardless of my feelings. Greer's statement is what it is. The original deed measurements are what they are. Margaret Whitfield's father kept those documents for 20 years without any connection to me, or to Broken River Ranch, or to whatever you think my motivation is. She paused. The evidence doesn't have feelings, Mr. Brooks. That's what makes it evidence. He looked at her for a long moment. The crowd around them was very still. I'll see you in Helena, he said. His voice was controlled. Nothing in it that could be called threatening. Yes, she said. You will? She turned and walked back toward Margaret and Elias. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The only place she felt the conversation was in her chest, where something tight had gathered, and was only now beginning to release. Elias looked at her when she reached him. He did not ask if she was all right. He said that was either very smart or very dangerous. Hopefully both, she said. The bank came apart on Monday. She had not expected it to happen this fast, and the speed of it told her something about Harlan Cole that she filed alongside everything else she'd learned about the people. Adjacent to this case, the specific moral character revealed by what a person does when the pressure changes direction. Forsythe's subpoena arrived at the Territorial Bank on Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, Cole had sent a message to Broken River Ranch asking to meet with Elias that evening, privately, without his lawyer present. Forsythe, when Evelyn relayed this through the message system they'd established, told her to attend the meeting, to say as little as possible, and to take notes on everything, Cole said, regardless of whether it seemed immediately relevant. Cole arrived at the ranch at 7 o'clock. He was a heavy-set man in his mid-50s who had the look of someone who had slept poorly for several nights in sequence, which she suspected was accurate. He sat at Elias's kitchen table and turned his hat in his hands and did not seem to know quite how to begin. She sat across from him with her notebook open. She did not introduce herself beyond her name. She did not explain her role. She let the silence work, because silence, in her experience, was an effective tool with people who had something they needed to say and lacked only the opening. Cole said the Western Capital loan documents. Elias waited. I processed the foreclosure based on records showing debt to Western Capital Associates, Cole said. I received those records from a man named Mercer, who represented himself as acting on behalf of an investor consortium with a legitimate claim against the ranch. He set his hat on the table. I didn't originate the loan. I was asked to process an existing claim. Existing meaning what exactly? Elias said. Meaning someone handed me documents showing a debt, and I processed the foreclosure action based on those documents. Cole's voice had the quality of a man reciting something he has been rehearsing. I didn't verify the origination independently. I should have. The documentation appeared in order. Evelyn wrote this down word for word. Where are those documents now? She said. Cole looked at her. In the bank's files. The subpoena, I've been told by my own lawyer that I need to produce them for the court. You're cooperating with the subpoena, she said. Yes, he said. I am. He looked back at Elias. I want to be clear that I did not knowingly participate in a fraudulent foreclosure. I was provided documentation that appeared legitimate, and I acted on it. Were you aware that the originating loan documents were not in the property owner's files? She asked. A pause. I was aware that the loan was arranged through a third-party representative, he said carefully. I was told the owner had been informed by Mercer. by Mercer. She wrote this down. Beside it, in her own shorthand, she noted, same representation made to Pratt. Consistent pattern. Mercer told each participant the owner had been informed. Nobody verified directly with owner. Mr. Cole, she said, when you reviewed the foreclosure documentation, did you notice anything that gave you pause? A longer pause this time. The loan amount, he said. It was larger than I would have expected given the ranch's documented assets. And the interest rate on the Western Capital documents was on the high end of what I'd normally see for a secured agricultural loan. But you processed it. He looked at his hands. I was told it was a private arrangement at private terms. It wasn't my place to question an investor's terms. She did not respond to this. She simply wrote it down, which was, she had found, often more effective than argument. A person who watches their own words being recorded begins to hear them differently. I'm withdrawing the foreclosure action, Coles said. Effective as of this morning, I filed the withdrawal with the county. The ranch is not in foreclosure. Elias went very still. Evelyn finished the sentence she was writing before she reacted to this. Then she looked up. Voluntarily, she said. I spoke with my lawyer, Cole said. Given the subpoena, and given he stopped. Given what I understand now about the full picture, proceeding with the foreclosure is not something the bank can do in good conscience. She wrote, Cole withdrawal, voluntary Monday. Reason, subpoena plus awareness of broader fraud picture. We'll still need the bank records for the hearing, she said. You'll have them, Cole said. He stood up. He picked up his hat. He looked at Elias with the expression of a man who knows that sorry is insufficient and is not going to insult the other person by saying it anyway. I hope the ranch does well, Carter. Elias said nothing. Cole left. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. He knew, Elias said. Not with heat. With the flat certainty of someone completing a conclusion they've been building toward. He suspected, she said. Which in some ways is worse, because suspicion is a choice you make to look away from. Is that better or worse for the case? Better, she said. A bank manager who voluntarily withdraws a foreclosure and agrees to produce subpoenaed records is not the same as a bank manager who fights it. Cole's cooperation is a piece of the story that shows the fraud was real enough to survive scrutiny even from the institution that processed it. She closed her notebook. Forsythe needs to know about this tonight. She wrote the message herself and sent it with Percy, who had become, over the past 2 weeks, a reliable courier for exactly this kind of communication. He was young enough to be invisible and observant enough to be useful, and she had found herself grateful for him in the way you become grateful for unexpected competencies in the people around you. The message to Forsythe took a half hour to compose, because she wanted it to be complete without being longer than necessary. When she finished, she read it back and then added one line at the end. Cole's voluntary withdrawal removes the foreclosure urgency but does not change our case. The hearing must proceed. Brooks is still operating. The other families are still affected. She sealed it and gave it to Percy and watched him ride out toward town. The days between Cole's withdrawal and the Helena hearing had a different quality than the days before. Less urgency in the mechanical sense, more in the psychological one. The immediate threat to the ranch had receded, which should have been relief, and was, partially, but which also created the particular danger of a moment when you have won something preliminary, and are tempted to treat it as the main thing. She did not let herself do that. She spent those days in 2 activities, preparing for the hearing, and paying attention to what Brooks was doing. He was not idle. Through Margaret, through Clara Hodge, through the network of ordinary observation that a small town generates continuously, and that she had learned to access without making herself conspicuous about it, she tracked the movements of his response. He had hired additional legal counsel, a man brought in from outside the territory, which told her he understood that local lawyers would have too many relationships to navigate. He had met privately with at least 3 people whose names appeared in her documents, which she noted carefully, and passed to Forsythe. He had made 2 visits to the county office, the second of which had lasted over an hour, and had left Calvert visibly shaken when Margaret saw him afterward. She did not know what Brooks had said in that hour. She suspected it involved a conversation about what Calvert's choices were and which of them was least bad for Calvert personally. This was how he worked, not with open threats, but with the precise application of a person's understanding of their own vulnerability. She hoped Calvert was more frightened of the court than of Brooks. She was not certain. She also spent time in those days doing something she had not allowed herself to do since arriving in Montana, because she had needed all of her attention for the immediate task and had not had anything left for the question of what came after. She thought about what she wanted, not what she needed to do, not what the case required. What she, Evelyn Mercer, who had come here on someone else's promise and stayed on her own terms, actually wanted from the life that was accumulating around her in this cold and enormous place. She had no clear answer. She had impressions. She had a room that faced east and gave her morning light. She had a table where she worked, and a lamp that was reliable, and a coffee she made herself because she woke earlier than anyone else on the ranch. She had the particular satisfaction of work that mattered to the specific people she was doing it for, which was different from the satisfaction of work done well in the abstract. She had Elias careful, quiet, direct, imperfect in the specific ways that made him believable as a person, rather than as an idea of one. She did not know what any of this added up to. She was 31 years old, and she had arrived here by accident and stayed by choice, and the choice kept deepening in ways she had not planned. On the 5th day before the hearing, she was working late when Elias came in from the barn, with mud on his boots, and sat down at the opposite end of the table and said, without preamble, "What happens after, Helena?" She looked up. "Win or lose," he said. "What do you want to happen?" She looked at him for a moment. He was asking directly, because he was the kind of person who asked directly, and because he had waited, she thought, until the immediate pressure had reduced enough that the question could be asked without feeling like an imposition on a person at capacity. "I don't know yet," she said, which was honest. "That's a fair answer," he said. He did not push past it. He got up and poured himself coffee and sat back down. And they worked in the same room in the particular comfortable silence of two people who have been through enough together. That silence between them is no longer the absence of something but a presence of its own kind. They traveled to Helena 3 days before the hearing. Forsythe met them at the hotel he'd arranged, and that evening he walked them through the hearing structure and what to expect from Brooks's counsels, a man named Ashford who was, Forsythe said, technically skilled and ethically flexible, which was the most charitable assessment he was prepared to offer. "He'll go after you personally," Forsythe told Evelyn. "We've discussed this. But I want you to understand the specific form it's likely to take in the courtroom. He won't be crude about it. He'll frame it as reasonable inquiry. He'll ask how long you've been in Montana, how long you've known Mr. Carter, what the nature of your arrangement at the ranch is. He'll ask about your professional history in a way designed to make your competence sound like ambition, and your findings sound like conclusions you arrived at before you found the evidence to support them. And my response is," she said, "accurate, specific, short." He looked at her. "Don't give him more than he asked for. Don't explain yourself beyond what the question requires. The evidence will speak if you let it. What we want is for you to be the person who read the documents, not the person who is angry about what they found." "I'm not angry," she said. Forsythe looked at her with the slight smile of a man who believed her, and also knew that 17 days of work toward this moment was its own kind of emotion. "Then that will come through," he said. She slept adequately that night. Not while her mind moved through the lines of the case the way it moved through account columns, checking for errors and finding mostly confidence in 1 or 2 places she wished. She had one more piece of evidence for, but adequately. She woke before sunrise, as she always did, and she sat with the unfamiliar darkness of an unfamiliar room, and thought about the hearing, and thought about Nathaniel Brooks, and thought about the letter still in her coat pocket. She'd carried it this entire time. She was not sure why. Not sentimentally, she felt nothing about it that resembled grief. More like the habit of a person who keeps primary documents in reach until the case they belong to is closed. The case was not closed yet. She got dressed. She organized her materials one final time. She went down to the hotel dining room and had coffee, and waited for the morning to become the day of the hearing, and she was steady in her chest and clear in her mind, and ready in all the ways that a person who cannot fully control what happens next can be ready. The territorial court in Helena occupied a building that was newer than she expected, and more formal than Silver Creek had led her to anticipate. The courtroom had a high ceiling and good windows, and the smell of linseed oil on the wooden floors, and there were already a dozen people in the gallery when they arrived, which told her the hearing had circulated as a matter of local interest. Brooks was already there. He sat at the respondent's table with Ashford on one side and another man she didn't recognize on the other, and he looked exactly as he had looked at the Harvest Festival, contained, composed, the expression of a man who is attending a proceeding he finds tiresome rather than threatening. She recognized this as performance. She had spent enough time reading his choices to understand that he never showed the real cost of anything. She sat at the petitioner's table with Forsythe, and she did not look at Brooks again after that first assessment. She arranged her materials. She noted where Judge Healy would be sitting. She made sure her written account was at the top of the stack, below it Greer's statement, below that Pratt's, and below that the document comparison that placed Margaret's archive against the county's current record. Healy came in at 9 o'clock precisely, which she took as a favorable sign about the man's relationship to his own time. He was perhaps 60, with the deeply unimpressed expression of a judge who has seen a great deal of human behavior and has arrived at a settled opinion about most of it. He reviewed the case papers for 4 minutes in complete silence while both tables waited. Then he looked up and said, "Mr. Forsythe, the hearing began." Forsythe opened by presenting the documentary case, the original surveys, the 1,884 revision, the measurements, the deed, the water rights language. He was methodical and completely unshowy about it, which she thought was exactly right. He let each document make its own argument. He called Margaret to testify about the archive and its chain of custody, and Margaret was the composed, authoritative version of herself that Evelyn had believed she would be, and Ashford's cross-examination achieved nothing beyond confirming that the documents had been maintained consistently for decades. Then Forsythe called Evelyn. She walked to the witness stand and she sat down and she looked at Healy rather than at Brooks, because Healy was the person whose understanding mattered. Forsythe took her through her account methodically, her background, her work at the shipping firm, the specific nature of her analytical method, her arrival in Silver Creek and the circumstances under which she had examined the Broken River records, what she had found, in what order, and what she had done with each finding. She answered every question the way she had drafted her written account, accurately, specifically, without elaboration beyond what was asked. She was aware of Ashford making notes. She was aware of the gallery listening. She was not afraid, which she found interesting. She had expected to be at least somewhat afraid, standing in a territorial courtroom giving testimony that accused a powerful man of fraud. What she felt instead was something closer to clarity. Then Ashford stood up. He was a tall man who moved with the careful economy of someone who knows that physical authority is its own form of argument. He approached the witness stand with a polite smile and said, "Miss Mercer, how long have you been in Montana?" 17 days, she said. "And in that time you've conducted a review of financial records, located witnesses, obtained signed statements, and built a legal case that you're now presenting to this court, with the assistance of Mr. Forsythe and several other individuals. Yes, quite an accomplishment for someone who arrived as a..." He paused, selecting his word. As a prospective bride, she looked at him steadily. "I arrived as a person with 9 years of professional experience in financial analysis. The reason I originally traveled to Montana is separate from what I found when I examined the records." "Is it?" he said pleasantly. "You were rejected by my client. You were publicly embarrassed. You were left in a difficult position in an unfamiliar town. And within days you were working to build a legal case against the man who rejected you. You understand why a reasonable person might see a connection." "A reasonable person," she said, "would also notice that the connection between my personal experience and the evidence is that my personal experience led me to examine records I otherwise wouldn't have examined. What I found in those records exists regardless of why I looked." She paused. "The original deed measurements are what they are. Aldous Pratt's statement describes what was done to him and who instructed it. James Greer's statement names the individual who directed him. These documents don't become different because of my history with the respondent." Ashford shifted his line of questioning. He tried Pratt's professional reputation. A man who had altered a survey was hardly a reliable witness about the alteration, was he? She answered that Pratt's statement described his role as a tool of the scheme rather than its architect, which the corroborating evidence supported. He tried Greer. A man who had admitted to falsifying records for years was asking the court to believe his word against a prominent citizen. She answered that Greer's testimony was corroborated by the ledger entries themselves, which were in his handwriting and which matched the pattern described in his statement with specificity that could not have been fabricated after the fact. He tried the pattern argument. Was it not possible that these various irregularities had independent explanations? She answered, possible in isolation. The probability diminished with each additional irregularity that benefited the same party, and that was connected to the same intermediary. Ashford looked at her for a moment. She could see him calculating, the same way Brooks had calculated at the festival, the specific arithmetic of a man determining whether a line of attack is working and whether to continue or redirect. He said, "You came to Montana with almost no money and no prospects. You found a sympathetic rancher and a dramatic story. Isn't it possible that your eagerness to establish yourself in Silver Creek to find a role, a place, a reason to stay shaped what you found in those records?" She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then she said, "That is a question about my motivation. I'll answer a different question, which is the relevant one." She looked at Healy. "The evidence in this case is not my motivation. It is the original deed, which contradicts the 1,884 survey on file. It is the county recorder's archive, which predates my arrival in Montana by decades. It is Pratt's statement about specific instructions he received and payments he was given. It is Greer's statement, which names both the intermediary and the principal. It is the bank's own records which the territorial bank has agreed to produce showing a loan with no legitimate origination." She paused. "You can dismiss my motivation. You cannot dismiss those documents. They were here before I arrived, and they will be here after this hearing is concluded." The room was quiet. Healy looked at Ashford. Ashford had nothing else. He said, "No further questions," and went back to his table. Evelyn returned to the petitioner's table and sat down. Forsythe did not say anything. He simply made a small note in his margin, and she saw that the note was a single word, underlined once. She did not ask him what it said. She already knew the hearing had changed. Healy did not rule from the bench. She had not expected him to. A judge who ruled immediately on a case of this complexity would be either extraordinarily confident or insufficiently careful, and Healy had impressed her throughout the hearing as a man who was neither reckless nor slow. He adjourned at 4:30 in the afternoon and told both parties he would deliver his written ruling within 10 days. 10 days was reasonable. 10 days was, in the arithmetic of what this case had taken and what it had cost, a very short time. They took the evening train back toward Silver Creek because neither she nor Elias had reason to remain in Helena, and because Forsythe had more work to do additional filings, correspondence with the Territorial Prosecutor's Office about the criminal referral he was preparing separately from the civil case. He shook their hands at the court steps with the brisk efficiency she had come to associate with him, told them the documentary record was strong, told them Healy was a fair judge, and walked back toward his hotel without looking for reassurance and without offering any that was false. She appreciated that about him. A lawyer who told you what you wanted to hear was useless. A lawyer who told you what the evidence supported and left the rest to the process was worth every contingency dollar. On the train, she and Elias sat across from each other and did not talk much. She was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep, could reach quickly the specific exhaustion of a person who has been at high alert for 3 weeks and whose body has begun, now that the immediate crisis has passed its peak, to present the invoice. She looked out the window at the Montana dark and thought about the hearing in pieces, testing each part of it the way you test a structure after weather, looking for what held and what had given. She thought it had held. She did not know if that was enough. There was a difference between a strong case and a one, and the 10 days between now and Healy's ruling were a space in which either outcome was technically possible, and she was honest enough with herself not to collapse that uncertainty prematurely in either direction. "You did well today," Elias said. She looked at him. He was watching her with the direct, unhurried attention she had come to recognize as his particular way of paying attention, no performance of concern, just actual looking. "We did well," she said. He shook his head slightly. "I mean you specifically the way you answered Ashford." He paused. "I've been in difficult conversations with men who were trying to diminish me. I usually want to argue back harder. You just stayed on the evidence." "Arguing harder is what he wanted," she said. "An angry woman is easier to dismiss than a precise one." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that something you had to learn? Or something you knew?" She thought about this honestly. "Both," she said. "I knew it abstractly from watching other people make the mistake. And then I had to learn it in practice, which is different and takes longer." He nodded slowly. Outside, the dark land moved past them in the opposite direction, and the train made its regular sound against the tracks, and she felt the exhaustion settle further into her bones and did not fight it. "Whatever Healy decides," she said, "what you know now is real. The fraud is documented. The pattern is documented. Even if the ruling goes wrong, which I don't think it will, but even if the information exists, Forsythe has it. Margaret has it. The Territorial Prosecutor's Office will have the criminal referral. That doesn't disappear." "I know," he said. "I'm saying it because I need to say it," she said, "not because you need to hear it." He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted slightly, not into anything dramatic, just a small deepening, the look of a person recognizing something accurately. "All right," he said. They arrived back at Broken River Ranch after midnight. Ruth had left food in the kitchen, covered with a cloth, which Evelyn discovered and ate standing at the counter, because she was too tired to sit formally about it. And she did not feel any particular way about eating cold beans standing in a ranch kitchen at midnight in Montana, which told her something about how thoroughly the territory had rearranged her relationship to what she required. She went to her room that faced east. She slept. The 10 days passed the way waiting always passes unevenly. The first 3 moved slowly, with the particular drag of a period when the urgent work is done and the replacement activity has not yet established its own rhythm. She occupied herself with things that needed doing regardless of the ruling, organizing the complete case file into a permanent archive, writing a detailed account of the investigative process for Forsythe's records, helping Margaret compile the documentation on the Holloway situation and the 2 other affected families so that Forsythe's broader petition had what it needed. By the 4th day, she had found her rhythm again, which was simply the rhythm of useful work, and the remaining days moved faster. She did not let herself think about the ruling directly. She had a long-standing habit, developed over years of waiting for the outcomes of financial reviews or partnership decisions, of putting a specific anticipated event in a kind of mental compartment, not suppressing it, not pretending it didn't exist, but containing it so that it did not occupy the foreground of every hour. The compartment was real, and she checked it honestly each morning, and then she went to work. What she thought about instead, in the spaces between tasks, was something Forsythe had said during the hearing. Not the legal argument, the observation he'd made over dinner the night before, when the three of them had been eating, and the conversation had moved away from the case temporarily. He had said, "The thing about this kind of fraud is that it relies entirely on nobody looking. Once someone looks, the whole architecture is visible." It was always visible. It was just designed to be looked past. She had thought about this since. About the specific human mechanism that Brooks had exploited, not just greed or fear in his instruments, but something in the community itself. The tendency to trust the appearance of official process. The disinclination to question a document that looked right. A boundary that had been submitted to the county. A debt that came with paperwork. The very systems that were supposed to protect people had been turned against them. And the protection had failed, not because the systems were fundamentally broken, but because they depended on the honest participation of the people operating them, and that participation had been purchased. She thought about what it meant that she had seen it when others hadn't. She did not think it meant she was smarter than the people who had missed it. She thought it meant she had arrived without the local assumptions, without the prior relationship to Brooks that made his authority seem like a natural feature of the landscape rather than a constructed one. She had looked because she had nothing to lose by looking, and she had seen because she hadn't yet learned what she was supposed to not see. There was something in that worth understanding. A place can protect itself against certain kinds of corruption only if someone inside it is still capable of looking at it from outside. And the people who can do that are almost always the ones who arrived as strangers and stayed for reasons the community didn't initially choose. She wrote none of this down. It was not at this point useful to the case, but she kept it. Forsythe's letter arrived on the 10th day. Percy brought it in from the road at mid-morning, and she was at the study table when he handed it to her, and she looked at it for a moment before she opened it. The envelope was plain, Forsythe's handwriting on the outside precise and unornamented in the way of a man whose professional hand has been trained to give nothing away. She opened it. She read it once through without stopping. Then she set it down on the table and looked at the wall, which was her habit with facts that needed a moment to settle before she responded to them. Then she picked it up and read it again. Elias came in from the yard 20 minutes later and found her still sitting at the table. He looked at her face and stopped in the doorway. "Tell me," he said. She handed him the letter. He read it standing. She watched his face as he moved through it, the careful expression of a man reading something important, the line of his jaw tightening and then releasing as he reached the central paragraph, and then a stillness that she had learned to read, as him landing on a fact and giving it the weight it deserved. Healy had ruled in favor of Elias Carter. The fraudulent survey of 1,884 was declared void. The original deed measurements were reinstated as the legal boundary of Broken River Ranch, including the eastern boundary running to Colders Creek, and the riparian rights the 1,884 revision had excised. The manufactured debt to Western Capital Associates was referred for investigation to the territorial prosecutor. The case against Nathaniel Brooks was referred in full for criminal proceedings, with Healy's ruling noting in specific language that the pattern of conduct documented across multiple properties demonstrated deliberate, organized fraud rather than the actions of an unsupervised associate. That last line was the one she had read twice. It was the line that mattered most legally. Because it closed the avenue, Brooks had left himself the claim that Mercer had acted alone, that he bore no knowledge or responsibility. Healy had read the pattern and named what it was, and that naming would follow every subsequent proceeding. Forsythe's letter added that Harlan Cole's cooperation had been formally noted, that the bank records had corroborated the manufactured loan exactly as she had predicted, and that the territorial prosecutor was prepared to move on the criminal case within the month. The Holloway family's situation was separately under review. The Fenwick case, the family who had already sold would be assessed for damages. He ended the letter with a single line. "The record you built made this possible. I want you to know that clearly." She had not expected that line. She read it twice also, and then she put the letter down on the table between them. Elias was still standing. He looked at the letter, then at her, then at some point in the room that was neither of them, which was the look of a person processing something that has multiple dimensions and can't be addressed in order. "It's over," he said. "The civil part is over," she said. "The criminal case will take longer. Brooks will fight it." He has money and legal resources, and he's been in difficult positions before. She paused. But the property is yours. The boundaries are restored. The foreclosure is gone. That's what we set out to do. He looked at her. That's what you set out to do, he said. I gave you a room and access to the ledgers. You trusted me, she said, with information that mattered to you and that you had every reason to be careful about. That's not a small thing. He was quiet for a long moment. She could hear the ranch outside, the particular sounds of mid-morning, Walt doing something near the barn, the wind coming down from the north, with the sharpness that had been in it for the past week, the sound of the land being exactly what it was, regardless of what was happening inside the house. What do you want to do? He said now. She understood that he was asking more than he was saying. He had asked a version of this question on the road back from the Foresight meeting, and she had said she didn't know yet, and he had accepted that. He was asking again because the situation had changed. The uncertainty that had structured the past 3 weeks had resolved, and what was left was a different kind of question, a longer one. She had been thinking about her answer for several days without quite admitting to herself that she was thinking about it. I want to write to the Holloways, she said, and find out what the 2 other families need, and talk to Foresight about whether there's a way to support the criminal case as it develops. She paused. I want to stay useful to this while it's still in motion. And after that, he said. She looked at him. He was watching her with the same direct, patient attention he always brought to things not pressing, not hoping out loud, just genuinely asking. She had come to trust that quality in him. It was rarer than it looked. I don't know what after looks like exactly, she said. But I know I'm not going back to Boston. He held her gaze. There's nothing there for me now, she said. And then, with the dry precision that was her version of humor, someone told me there was nothing here for me either. He was wrong about that. Something shifted in Elias's face, brief and real, and not performed. The expression of a person who has been waiting for a particular word and has now heard it and doesn't quite know how to receive it without making too much of it. You'd need something to do, he said. The ranch doesn't generate enough work for someone who does what you do. The ranch's books need proper management, she said. And after what Foresight showed us about the Holloway situation and the Fenwicks, there are other families in this territory who need someone who can read what's happening to their finances before it becomes a foreclosure notice. Foresight can't do that work. He's a lawyer. He comes in after. And you want to come in before. I want to be the person who sees it before it becomes a crisis, she said. Someone has to be. He was quiet, turning this over. That's not a small thing to take on, he said. No, she agreed. It isn't. You'd need a base, he said carefully. Somewhere to work from, I would, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something was working in his expression that he was not going to rush, and she did not rush it either. She had learned in 3 weeks that he was a man who needed to arrive at things in his own time, and that pushing him moved him backward rather than forward. The East Room, he said finally, gets good light in the morning. She looked at him. I'm aware of that. It could be a proper office, he said. Not just a borrowed room. A pause, if you wanted it to be. She understood what he was offering and what he was not yet saying, and the specific courage it took for a man like him to offer even this much, a man who had been burned by misplaced trust, who had watched someone he'd worked alongside for 11 years falsify records under his father's name, who had spent 2 years believing his family's failure was real before she arrived and showed him it was constructed. Trust, for a person who had been betrayed that specifically, was not a small thing to offer anyone. It was the most significant thing he had. A proper office, she said. Yes, I'd want that. He nodded once. He did not smile exactly, but the quality of his stillness changed. Something released in it, some held tension that had been there for weeks and possibly longer. I'll build out the shelving, he said. The east wall has enough room. You don't need to. I know I don't need to, he said. He looked at her steadily. I want to. She looked back at him for a moment. The room was quiet, and the Montana morning was loud outside in the way it always was, wind and animals, and the vast, unremarkable business of land that did not concern itself with human arrangements, and she felt something she had not felt since. Before she'd stepped off that train, which was the specific sensation of standing on solid ground. Not perfect ground. She was clear-eyed enough to know that what was beginning here was imperfect, in all the ways that real things are uncertain in its particulars, untested in its duration, carrying the weight of everything that had come before it for both of them. She did not know what she and Elias were to each other, yet in any language she could commit to. She was not in a hurry to name it. Names came with time, and she had learned in the past 3 weeks that she was better at time than she had previously given herself credit for. She knew what she wanted. She knew where she wanted to be. That was enough to begin with. She went to the train depot 3 days later. Not to leave. She went because she had unfinished business there that was small in the practical sense and large in the private one, and she had been carrying it long enough. Elias drove her in without asking why, because she had told him she needed to go, and he had accepted that without needing the explanation. She was coming to understand simply the way he operated. He trusted the people he trusted, and the trust was not conditional on full information. It was not naive. It was a choice made deliberately based on what he had observed. She valued it more than she knew how to say at this stage, so she didn't try to say it yet. The platform was empty, mid-morning on a weekday, no train due for hours. The same boards that she had stood on 3 weeks ago. The same gap between them where her trunk had caught, and she had stopped and repositioned her grip while the watching crowd pretended not to watch. She stood there for a moment and looked at the platform and the empty track and the far distance where the valley opened up toward the mountains. Montana at this hour in this light was the color of everything at once, the gray-brown of the dried grass, the blue of the sky that came in from the east like a door opening, the dark line of the pines on the ridge that ran north-south above the valley. She reached into her coat pocket. The letter was still there. It had been there for 23 days, folded and refolded along the same creases until the paper had gone soft at the lines. She took it up and looked at the envelope. Nathaniel Brooks's handwriting on the outside, her name in his careful banker script. She did not open it. She knew what it said. She had read it enough times that the words were part of her now, whether she wanted them to be or not. Nothing here for you. She thought about the human instinct to keep the evidence of a wound, to hold on to the thing that hurt, because letting go of it feels like letting the person who did it off the hook. She understood that instinct. She had honored it in her own way, by keeping the letter through everything, by using it as a reminder of where she'd started and why the work mattered. But she had spent 23 days proving, in the most specific possible terms, that he had been wrong, and the proof was not in her coat pocket. The proof was in the court ruling sitting on Elias's desk at Broken River Ranch. It was in the signed statements in Forsythe's legal file. It was in Margaret Whitfield's archive and in the territorial prosecutor's office in Helena and in the restored boundary line running to Coulter's Creek, where it had always, legally, rightfully run. The proof was done. The letter had served its purpose. She tore it. Not dramatically, she was not a dramatic person, and the platform was empty, and there was no audience for whom she needed to perform the moment. She just tore it the way you tear something that is finished once across. Then the pieces small enough that the wind could take them without apology. The Montana wind, which had opinions about everything and deferred to nothing, took them. She watched the pieces go. Some flew high, some skittered along the platform boards, some dropped between the gap and the planks. Within 30 seconds, there was nothing visible on the platform that had not been there before she arrived. She stood there another minute, not because she needed to, but because the minute felt earned. Then she turned and walked back to where Elias was waiting with the wagon, and she climbed up beside him, and he looked at her quick and direct, the way he always looked at things, and whatever he read in her face satisfied him, because he did not ask anything. He simply picked up the reins. "Home," he said. She settled beside him. The word had not alarmed her. That was new. 3 weeks ago, the word would have landed with the particular ache of something she did not have, and was not sure she would find in Montana. Now it simply meant what it meant: the ranch, the east room with its morning light, the work waiting on the table, the man sitting beside her who had offered her a room when she had nothing and had not yet asked for anything back. "Home," she said. They drove out of Silver Creek in the ordinary way, along the unpaved road that she now knew by its particular bumps and turns, and the valley opened up around them with its enormous, indifferent beauty, and she did not feel small inside it the way she had on the first day. You either made your peace with Montana or you didn't, and she had made hers. The criminal case against Nathaniel Brooks was filed 6 weeks later. He hired 3 lawyers and moved to challenge the jurisdiction and submitted a 40-page response to the territorial prosecutor's office, characterizing the entire proceeding as a conspiracy organized by a Boston woman with a personal grievance, a sympathetic rancher with financial difficulties. The 40-page response did not change the documents. It did not change Pratt's statement or Greer's testimony or the bank records or the original surveys in Margaret Whitfield's boxes. It did not change the water rights language in the original deed, or the 300 yards between where the 1,884 survey put the eastern boundary and where it had always legally been. Evelyn read the 40-page response when Forsythe sent her a copy, and she made margin notes on 12 of its 40 pages, and she sent those notes back to Forsythe, and Forsythe incorporated 3 of her points into the prosecution's formal reply. The Holloway family retained Forsythe that winter, and the survey fraud against their property was documented and filed. The estate of the Fenwicks, the family who had already sold, pursued a civil damages claim. 2 additional families came forward once it became clear that there was a legal process capable of hearing them. The pattern that Evelyn had mapped in her 12-page summary became, in Forsythe's hands, the foundation of a proceeding that grew larger than any of them had originally anticipated. She worked from the east room at Broken River Ranch. The shelving Elias had built ran the length of the eastern wall and held her document boxes in the organized system she had developed: date, property, document type, case status. She had a proper desk now, bought from the furniture store in Silver Creek by a man who had once watched her drag her trunk across a platform and who had not offered to help and who, she noticed, made a point of acknowledging her directly when their paths crossed now. She did not hold the original against him. People revised their assessments when given new information, and she believed in the capacity for revision, even in people who had not shown her their best side first. Margaret Whitfield came by twice a week. They had developed a working relationship that had become something more than that without either of them making a particular moment of it the easy, honest friendship of two women who had found each other useful, and then found each other interesting, and then found each other necessary in the way that certain people become necessary, not because you cannot survive without them, but because the quality of your thinking improves when they are in the room. Ruth still made the coffee and did not say much, which Evelyn had come to understand was not unfriendliness, but simply Ruth's relationship with words, which was economical by choice and therefore more trustworthy than the other kind. Walt and Percy continued their work, and Percy had developed a sideline as a document courier that had earned him a small supplemental income and a seriousness about confidentiality that she had not had to teach him. He had simply understood, instinctively, that some information was not his to share, and she respected that more than any explicit instruction would have produced. Elias worked the ranch. He was not a man who changed quickly or expressed himself easily, but she had stopped expecting either of those things from him, and had found that the absence of expectation left more room for what he actually was: steady, present, honest in the specific way of someone who has decided that honesty is less complicated than the alternative, and has lived by that decision long enough to have no regrets about it. He made the shelving and kept the coffee strong, and did not ask her to be different from what she was, which was the most significant gift anyone had offered her in longer than she could cleanly account for. They were building something. She did not always have language for exactly what, and she had stopped needing the language. It was enough to know that what they were building was real, and that she had chosen it with the fullest version of herself, not out of necessity or desperation, but out of genuine desire for the specific life it was becoming. This was not what she had traveled nearly 2,000 miles to find. It was better. Not because it was easier, it was not easier. None of it had been easy, and she suspected that what came next would not be easy either in its own different ways. But because she had built it herself, out of the materials of a situation she had not chosen, using the skills she had always had, but had not always been given room to use. There is a particular quality to a life you have earned, rather than been handed. It does not feel like luck. It does not feel like someone else's story that you happen to land in. It feels like yours, imperfect and specific and difficult, in ways that correspond to your own particular difficulties, and good in ways that correspond to your own particular understanding of good. Evelyn Mercer had arrived in Silver Creek with a trunk she could barely drag, $11, a rejection letter, and the deeply inconvenient conviction that the numbers in front of her did not add up to what they were supposed to mean. 3 weeks later, she had a room that faced east. 3 months later, she had a practice, a purpose, a place, and a man who built shelving without being asked and did not require her to be smaller than she was. She was not going to call this a happy ending, because happy endings implied that endings were the point, and she had stopped believing in endings as a useful category. What she had was a continuing a life in motion, still generating its own complications and its own satisfactions and its own moments of standing on unfamiliar ground and deciding what to do with it. The rejected bride who had stepped off the train with nothing had not disappeared. She was still there, in the specific memory of what it felt like to read that letter on a public platform, while people pretended not to watch. She was the reason Evelyn had stayed, and the reason she had looked, and the reason the numbers had refused to add up quietly when she could have let them. She kept that. She intended to keep it, not as a wound, as information. The kind you carry forward because it tells you something true about what you are capable of when the situation demands it. Outside, the Montana winter was coming in from the north with its full weight and no apology, and the ranch was making its particular preparations for cold, and somewhere on the eastern boundary that ran to Coulter's Creek, the land simply was what it had always been: water and grass, and the specific character of a place that had existed before any of them and would exist after. Evelyn Mercer sat at her desk in the east room with the morning light coming through the window and her notebook open to a fresh page, and she wrote the date at the top in the careful, Deliberate hand of someone beginning a document they intend to finish. The numbers were in front of her. She went to work.